Chapter 1497. In the midst of the girls' teasing, Long Shangfang gradually gained momentum. Everyone's clothes began to flutter in the wind, making whining noises as if they were crying. It made the young knight look even more spirited and bright. Perhaps praising him as, what an immortal from heaven, was not an exaggeration. It was unavoidable that people would be surprised that such a barren and fierce cold land could nurture such a playboy who could make the famous scholars of Jiangnan feel ashamed of their inferiority. Therefore, even a proud and spirited woman like Jean Bauscher had to admit that this uninvited guest, regardless of his martial arts cultivation, at the very least, his appearance was extremely good. If he was in the scholarly world of Jiangnan, which valued etiquette the most, this person could easily become a distinguished guest of those noble families. The old man seemed to have already recognized the young man's identity. His eyes were complicated, with the kindness of an elder, the pity of an outsider, and the gratification of seeing a fellow traveler. Under the scrutinizing gaze of the crowd, the young knight who had threatened to perform the duties of a host under the hooves of thousands of Beimang cavalry skillfully turned his horse around and extended his hand, indicating for the carriage to go ahead. Han Guzi nodded. Song Xinsheng, who was acting as the coachman, lightly waved the whip in his hand. Shoo, he urged the horse to set off again. Han Guzi had taken in a total of 8 disciples. The first disciple was Yu Songyang, who was slow in speech but quick in action. He was the famous teacher Ji Shang of Shangyin Academy. His ability to comprehend was profound, but he was also brave enough to change the classics. He had a famous argument with the Confucian scholar Yao Baifeng. The two Confucian sages exchanged letters 18 times each. Yu Songyang also had the nickname of Mr. 18 Brushes, half praised and half criticized in the literary world of Liang. Then there was Chang Sui, a great poet who acted absurdly. Then there was Su Huang, a master of the art of war who was a distant relative of Su Gong, Sima Qian of the Zongheng family, Su Weisheng of Beiliang, Jin Baosher of the Jin family of Langia, and Lu Duanmao, the grandson of the Lu family of Yangling. The last one, who was relatively unknown, was the Prince Zhao Kai who went to the western regions with the silver vase and died outside the Iron Gate Pass. Among Han Guzi's disciples, there were both men and women. There were those who were gentle, refined, and strict, and there were also those who abandoned etiquette as if it were a pair of worn-out shoes. There were only 8 of them, but they were involved in as many as 5 schools of thought: Confucianism, art of war, yin, and yang. The most important thing was that Han Guzi's disciples were all worthy of being called dragons and phoenixes among men. Therefore, in the Liang dynasty, this old man had the supreme reputation of Shuani. This meant that no matter when and where old Mr. Han appeared, whether it was the emperor, the ministers, or the common people, everyone who saw him had to avoid paying respects to him. As for who was the first to use this nickname, there was no proof. Some people said that it was either the Grand Preceptor of West Chu, Sun Shiji, or the State Preceptor Li Mi. Others swore that Huang Sanjia was the most arrogant old faker. In short, Han Guzi's reputation in the Liang dynasty grew as the Lu brothers of Linlang, Lu Daolin, Lu Baijia, Beiliang, Yao Baifeng, and Qi Yanglong entered the capital one after another to become officials. The old man, who had always shut himself in and refused to pay any attention to political affairs, was becoming more and more famous. Everyone was counting on their fingers to calculate when this old man would be summoned to the capital. When that time came, not only would he be extremely noble, but he would also gradually become the Minister of Rights. In order to take care of Han Guzi's old body, the convoy continued to move forward slowly. However, the north side was already covered in dust under the hooves of the Beimang cavalry. Soon, they would arrive. The atmosphere here began to become a little strange. Even the fearless and heartless Han Guoxiu was a little flustered. From time to time, she would turn her head to look to the north, as if she could feel the violent tremors on the ground. Previously, she had used Sima Qian to kill the young knight, but unfortunately, she didn't get any response. That person neither refuted nor became angry out of humiliation. This made the girl, who was used to being arrogant in Shangyin Academy, very dissatisfied. She had already thought of many ingenious backup plans, but in the end, her opponent was a guy who was even more boring than Uncle Blockhead, Yu Songyang. She was so frustrated that she almost suffered internal injuries. Han Guxiao couldn't help but shout at the back of the rider, "There are thousands of Beimang barbarians coming from the north. Can you do it or not? If you can't do it, hurry up and say it. Don't drag us down with you. We'll be in a mess if you do." The young knight turned his head and smiled. He joked, "Miss, you ask me if I can do it, and I always say yes." Sima Can, who understood the meaning behind the words, tried hard to hold back his laughter. He was afraid that Han Guxiao, this unruly girl, would use him as a punching bag. Jean Baosher frowned. Her impression of this person had taken a turn for the worse. She quickly classified him as an unscrupulous playboy. The simple-minded Han Guxiao was a little suspicious. Really? Don't puff yourself up at your own cost. When the northern barbarian cavalry comes, no one will save you. The young knight, who seemed to be in a good mood, laughed it off. Jean Baosher turned around and knocked on the girl's forehead. She whispered, "Silly girl, don't say any more." Han Guxiao asked in a daze, "Sister Jean, why did you hit me?" Han Guxiao suddenly understood. She smiled and whispered in Jean Baosher's ear, "Sister Jean, have you taken a fancy to this pale young man who looks like a dog?" "Sigh, it's not that I want to criticize you. This guy's appearance is not bad, but compared to my future husband, Xie Shibian, he's still thousands of miles away. My mother said that you can't judge a man by his appearance and family background. Character is more important than anything else. Pale young men, especially those sons of generals, kill and kill all year round. They definitely have bad tempers and are uneducated. Sister Jean, I'll say this in advance. If you dare to marry a pale young man, we'll break off our friendship." Jean Baosher, who didn't know whether to laugh or cry, fiercely pinched the ear of this silly girl who spoke without thinking. "Is Xie Shibian yours? Who was the one who cried and told me that you wrote dozens of letters to him, but he didn't reply to any of them?" Just as the two girls were scratching each other's itches and playing around, the knight had already bid farewell to Han Guzi and rode away to the north. Seeing the back of the horse, Han Guxiao widened her eyes. Has this guy lost his mind? Or was I right? Is he in a hurry to be reincarnated? The girl shouted, "Grandpa, who is he? You must already know, right?" The old man leaned lazily against the wall of the carriage, smiling but not saying anything. Han Guxiao complained, "Stingy." Su Huang, who was beside the carriage, asked softly, "It's him?" The old man nodded and looked at the sky with squinted eyes. He sighed, "How does Chang Sui write a poem?" When he was 15 or 20 years old, he captured the northern barbarian knight on foot. His iron robe was as white as snow. Jean Baosher subconsciously grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist. With a heroic spirit, he followed the old man and recited, "One man can fight 3,000 miles away, one sword can fight against 1,000,000 soldiers." But what happened next stunned everyone except Han Guzi. After galloping for a mile, they vaguely saw the man stop in front of them. Then, dozens of Beimang's elite Black Fox guards suddenly turned around. Jean Baosher and the others could barely see the armored Beimang cavalry. For no reason, they slowed down their charge. Then, without hesitation, they turned around and ran away. In an instant, there was no one left. No matter what, there was an army of 2,000 to 3,000 cavalrymen. Even though the thunder was loud and the rain was small, there was no rain at all. It was Su Fengnian, who had rushed over after receiving the report from Whispering Water. He didn't chase after them alone. Instead, he reined in his horse and galloped back to the carriage. The reason he came here as a guard was that the 500 elite Baoyang cavalry might not be enough to protect everyone. After all, the old man was one of Second Sister's teachers. It was reasonable for Su Fengnian to show up. Secondly, he wanted to see for himself the elegant demeanor of the evasive old man Han. He wanted to see if he could recruit him to Mount Qingliang. Unfortunately, when he saw Han Guzi for the first time, he knew that the old man didn't have this intention. He was just like a scholar who wanted to travel and study. A melon that was forcefully picked would not be sweet. Moreover, the old man's reputation was only a hair's breadth lower than that of the head of the secretariat, Qianglong. Even if Su Fengnian was one of the 4 great grandmasters, he couldn't force the old man to join him. If he forcefully detained this group of people, then the Central Plains, which had finally changed their view of Biyao, would probably view them as enemies. Taking a step back, Deputy Administrator Song Dongming, Green Deer Cave Academy's Huang Chang, and the thousands of scholars in Liangzhou would all rebel. Su Fengnian approached the carriage. He cupped his fists and said, "Old Mr. Han, no matter what, I still hope that you can make a trip to Liangzhou on your way back. Even if you don't enter the city, there will be people coming out of the city to welcome you." Han Guzi shook his head and smiled. It wasn't easy for this old man to muster up the courage to travel. Every place I can go is a good place. Therefore, I won't go back. If nothing unexpected happens, we'll go west. We'll see Qingsang City, Linyao City, and Fengshan City. We'll stop at Mount Lantua and then go south. We'll enter Nanzhao and see the scenery of the South Sea. Then we'll go north to western Shu. Finally, we'll take a boat back along the Guangling River. Su Fengnian nodded and smiled. Then I wish you a safe journey. The old man suddenly chuckled as if he was taking advantage of his seniority. What, you're leaving just like that? I can't be sure that the thousands of Beimang cavalry have really retreated. They're not going to send us off. If we die here, it won't be a small matter. The Beiliang cavalry can bear the burden of the million-strong Beimang army, but you may not be able to bear the infamy. For some reason, Su Fengnian thought of that lousy chess player Chancellor Wang, who was also Second Sister's master. Why was it that Second Sister's master was so disrespectful towards his elders? Su Fengnian said helplessly, "Then I'll send you off for another 10 miles. Any more and I won't be able to." The old man waved his hand vigorously and said, "Back then, in order to let Su Weisheng enter Shangyin Academy, the great general paid for the construction of the long embankment along the lake. It's called 10 miles of spring dawn. My legs are so weak that I've had to walk on it every day. Therefore, I feel that your 10 miles of sending me off isn't sincere enough. It should be at least 20 miles. Is that okay?" Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "Okay, then 20 miles it is." Han Guoxiu rolled her eyes. "You rascal, why do you always say yes when anyone asks you if it's okay?" Chapter 1498. Even Su Fengnian, whose eloquence was unrivaled under the heavens, was left speechless. Finally, Sima Qian could not help but laugh heartily. This silly girl truly had a tacit understanding of each other. She had unknowingly delivered a fatal blow to her opponent. With a face full of curiosity, the young girl asked a question that many of the people present wanted to know the answer to. Why did that Beimang cavalry run away without fighting? Su Fengnian replied with a deadpan expression, "I don't know either. I only said one sentence to them." Knowing that it was most likely a trap, Sima Qian and Jean Baosher blurted out at the same time, "Don't ask." However, Han Guoxiu impatiently asked, "What did you say?" Su Fengnian replied, "I told them that it was getting late and that Lu Gui told them to return home and start cooking." Han Guoxiu stared blankly for a moment. With round eyes, she asked, "Are those northern barbarians idiots? They really believe that?" Su Fengnian smiled mischievously and nodded. "That's right. They really believed it." Sima Qian covered his forehead with his hand. "This silly girl. You haven't even climbed out of the first trap, yet you've already jumped into the second one at lightning speed." Jean Baosher felt extreme disgust towards this fellow who liked to act mysterious with his mouth full of oil. In a cold voice, he asked, "Is it fun?" Su Fengnian smiled and said no more. "In order for your group to travel in a carefree manner and deal with Zhao Gou's death soldiers, 26 people from Beiliang's Fu Shui room have already died. More than half of them died outside of Beiliang's borders." This time, Han Guzi was leading his troops west into Liangliang. As a remnant of northern Han whose entire family had perished in the flames of war, Yu Songyang naturally would not accompany him. Chang Sui, the famous poet and writer, was the only disciple of Han Guzi who did not enter Beiliang's territory. He was clad in a green robe, wielding a sword and a wine pot, and went to Ji Bei in an elegant manner. Of the three Jianghu masters, apart from the steel breaker, Song Xinsheng, who was Han Guzi's best friend, Qi Zihu, who carried the famous saber, Forbidden Fire, was a chivalrous man. The young man at the tail of the caravan, Lu Shouwen, had an extraordinary background. He came from the Huiji Lu clan, which was ranked third among the clans in the world that Li Yang had recently set. Although Lu Shouwen was born of a concubine, the Lu clan had always valued both civil and martial arts. Lu Shouwen, who had attained the cultivation of third rank before the age of 30, was naturally a favored figure of the clan. The spy report from the Fu Shui Fong mentioned that this person, like Lu Duanmao, liked the woman named Jean Baosher, but this was not the main point. The main point was that Lu Shouwen was most likely a double agent. On the surface, he was under Zhao Yi's Guangling Springs Snow building, but in secret, he might be a spy from Nanjiang Road. Along the way, Lu Shouwen had risked his life to kill 3 Zhao Go masters. Once he returned, he would not be able to live in peace. It could be said that he was an infatuated type who did not love the country but the beauty. For some reason, Han Guzi suddenly had a strange idea. He said that he wanted to try the feeling of riding a horse in the west wind. Song Xinsheng, Su Huang, and the others could not persuade him. Han Guxiu, who wanted to see the world in chaos, clapped her hands and cheered. She taught the worried Jean Baosher a lesson. With the help of the sweaty Sima Can, the old man finally got on the horse. Su Fengnian had no choice but to move closer to prevent the old man from falling off the horse. Fortunately, the old man did not seem to have any intention of urging his horse forward. He rode side by side with Su Fengnian, while Su Huang carefully guarded him on the other side. The old man, who was swaying on the horse's back, laughed and said, "It's true that this old man is young and wild, but it's a pity that I don't have the money to wear that brocade hat and marten coat. I haven't touched a saddle in the past few decades, and I don't even have the luxury of riding a horse. Thinking back to the aggressive manner of those Beimang barbarians just now, I'm really ashamed. I've read books and taught books for most of my life. The number of students and unofficial disciples I've taught is at least 20. In the end, even including the assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Su Gong, who is already on the border between the two Liao countries, I don't think anyone has ever killed a Beimang barbarian with their own hands." The old man sadly murmured, "Not a single one." Su Fengnian said with a smile, "Yes, there is." The old man nodded and said, "Yes, I'm old and muddle-headed. That girl Su led the famous Bailiang cavalry straight into Beimang's hinterland. At that time in Shangyin Academy, her fellow disciples stole a lot of jars of wine from me. The next day, they all reeked of alcohol and were disgraceful. As for me, I just pretended not to see it. At that time, even Yu Songyang was no exception. It's said that he almost fell asleep during the lecture. Therefore, what the great general did back then was right. What you did was even better. Otherwise, with half of my neck buried in the yellow earth, I wouldn't have risked universal condemnation to make this trip." Su Fengnian said, "Old mister, you're risking universal condemnation." The old man said apologetically, "Although you didn't say it, I still have to apologize to you and your Bailiang. This old man only did it on a whim, but many people were killed because of it. In the end, it was like going on a spring vacation. I just patted my butt and left. I couldn't help you at all. For the sake of my reputation, I didn't even get to see that girl Su even once when I was already at your doorstep." Su Fengnian said softly, "The scholars of Shangyin Academy can't withstand the torment of wind and rain. Old Mister didn't do anything wrong. Whether or not the warriors of Bailiang can defend the Northwest, this world still needs scholars to govern. Maybe one day, we'll need them to walk out of the library, put down their books, and step forward bravely in front of the flood of horses' hooves." Jean Bao Room, who was behind the 3 riders, had actually been listening attentively. After hearing these words, she was a little surprised. She had to admit that she had a new level of respect for him. She couldn't help but raise her head and stare at the back of the rider. He was travel-worn and wore very ordinary clothes. He carried a cotton bag on his back. He didn't have the cold knives and light crossbows that Bailiang's roaming cavalry were equipped with. If it was the son of a general like Northern Liang, which was as numerous as the hairs on an ox, it didn't seem like it. Although many of the descendants of Northern Liang generals had joined the army, she really couldn't think of a young person in Liuzhou who was so special to be able to chat calmly with her teacher. Could it be the Han clan strategist Qin Shiliang who was unknown in Jiangnan but had risen to fame in Northern Liang? Han Guoxiu whispered into Jin Baoru's ear, "Sister Jin, I think this guy might be that person." Jin Baoru laughed involuntarily and shook her head. "Impossible. You don't practice martial arts. You don't know what kind of power the most outstanding great grandmasters in the world have. I've seen a number of first-level great grandmasters." Han Guoxiu hurriedly interrupted, "How could I not know? Isn't it just a dragon's roar, a tiger's step in the abyss, a mountain's peak? The older ones should have some immortal-like and imposing manner." Then the girl muttered to herself, "Now that you mention it, this guy really isn't an expert. Especially when he smiles, he doesn't look like a good person. He can't even compare to Lu Shouwen, who blocked a knife for you." In the end, Han Guoxiu sighed and said, "There's nothing I can do. I originally wanted to come to Beiliang this time to see that Su Fengnian. Many of our sisters in the school seem to have given themselves a bewitching potion. If I see him with my own eyes, when I go back, won't they die of envy? Haha. I've thought about it. When the time comes, I'll say that I've seen Su Fengnian. I'll also tell them that the guy is 10 feet tall, with a strong back and a bare waist. His face is full of whiskers, and his arms are as thick as their legs. What dragon, phoenix, northern Su, southern Song. Anyway, we've seen that Song Maolin with our own eyes. He's really handsome. Other than my husband, Xie Shibian, I don't think anyone in the world can compare to Song Maolin. When I think of them hearing my description, I think of them crying in disappointment and sadness." The girl's little head leaned against Jin Baoru's back and she laughed to herself. Chapter 1499. Jin Baoshi shook her head and laughed softly. "You, don't be so bad. Be careful that you won't be able to get married. You should at least leave some memories for your friends." Han Guoxiu said childishly, "No. Who told them to say that my husband is not even 1/10,000th of that Su Fengnian?" Lu Duanmao was about to interrupt, but Lu Shouwen had already urged his horse forward and came to Jin Baoshi's side. Lu Duanmao, who was born to be able to ward off evil spirits, had a sad look in his eyes and stopped moving. The sharp-eyed Sima Can sighed quietly. He had told his junior many times that junior sister Jean was not the kind of woman who judged people by their appearance, but Lu Duanmao would always be discouraged when he saw her. When his junior brother Zhao Kai was still in the academy, he had successfully tricked him into confessing after he got drunk. Although Jin Baoshi was not moved, it was obvious that she did not hate him. However, Lu Duanmao was still so scared that his legs trembled after he woke up. Originally, Zhao Kai had already thought of how to encourage Lu Duanmao to strike while the iron was hot. However, with the sudden departure of his junior brother from Shangyin Academy and the shocking news that followed, Lu Duanmao completely retreated. For half a year, he drowned his sorrows in alcohol. In the end, he was awakened by Jin Baoshi, who could not stand it anymore. Only then did he let go of the wine jars and jugs that he relied on and was teased by others as the drinking wife, by others. Originally, except for Su Weisheng and Jin Baoshi, the 6 men of the same sect had all agreed that after Zhao Kai and Lu Duanmao returned with their beauties, they would get drunk together and drink all of their master's hidden wine in one go. Sima Can looked to the south with red eyes. "Junior brother, you and I agreed to be the monarch and minister who would go down in history together." Sima Can did not hate the Beiliang, nor did he hate the young man who was His Royal Highness at that time. He just missed his playful junior brother very much. Lu Shouwen rode side by side with Jin Baoshi and Han Guoxiu, but he didn't speak to Jin Baoshi, who fell in love at first sight. He looked towards Han Guoxiu and said with a gentle smile, "Are you scared after seeing those northern Mang barbarians?" Han Guoxiu, who was naturally closer to that coward Lu Duanmao in her heart, rolled her eyes and said, "Scared to death." Lu Shouwen was somewhat helpless, but he was not angry. In fact, his current situation was much better than when he had been targeted by the little girl. He shifted his gaze and asked softly, Miss Jean, why did the Beimang cavalry take the initiative to retreat? Jean Baosher shook his head and smiled faintly. I don't know. That person didn't want to talk about it, and Sir didn't want to reveal the secrets of heaven. Lu Shouwen made a sound of acknowledgement and did not continue to pester him with words. He just silently rode his horse. After coming back to his senses, Sima Qian couldn't help but sigh. His junior brother Lu Duanmao had met his match. At the very front, Han Guzi and Su Huang, one knew, the other was the first to guess Su Fengnian's true identity. The three of them casually talked about the Battle of Guangling. Han Guzi, intentionally or otherwise, spoke less and less. Most of the time, Su Huang methodically explained his views on the situation. Su Fengnian did not blindly agree. Occasionally, he bluntly questioned and rebutted, and Su Huang answered them one by one. However, the two of them still had a large difference in understanding of the final victory and defeat of the naval battle on the river. Su Huang believed that victory and defeat were decided quickly. The Zhao Yi Navy, with the help of the Qingzhou Navy, had won. Su Fengnian believed that after 2 to 3 months, the West Chu side that Chao Chongqing was on would win. Han Guzi only said that the two of them were half right and half wrong. Afterward, he did not express any more opinions. Later, Su Huang asked about the battle at Calabash in detail. Su Fengnian told him everything he knew. In the end, Su Huang sighed emotionally. Back then, the Beiliang had said that they would eat 150,000 Beimang at Calabash. Before Su Gong entered the capital to take up his post, he did not believe it. He said it was not too much, but too little. When Su Fengnian and Su Huang talked about building another Huda city in Liangzhou, the old man casually mentioned that Su Huang had this idea 3 years ago when he was doing his calculations. At the time, many people thought it was a fool's dream. In the large education palace, only Ko Jianghu and Qi Shens believed it. Just as Su Huang seemed to carelessly mention that Beimang's Central Front might divert a portion of its forces to the Eastern Front in Liuzhou, Han Guzi, who seemed to be unable to stand the bumpy ride of the horse, asked with a smile, Have we traveled more than 10 li? Su Huang was stunned. He nodded and said, Almost. The old man suddenly smiled at Su Fengnian and said, It doesn't matter if you travel 10 li or 20 li. In fact, the thought is more important than the distance. As for this old man, I won't delay your journey to Huayang Pass. Once the Su girl gets angry, it's not just her fellow disciples who are all trembling in fear, like mice meeting a cat. In fact, I'm also afraid. The old man muttered that he was old, really old. He got off the horse with difficulty. After getting into the carriage, he still did not enter the cabin. He sat down cross-legged behind Song Xinsheng and waved his hand. He laughed loudly and said, I have no wine to send you off. I'm old. I have the heart but not the strength. Su Fengnian smiled and stopped his horse. A rider brushed past him. He watched the group gradually disappear into the distance. The wind in Longsheng was strong. Su Fengnian's sleeves wantonly fluttered forward. Sima Qian gave the little girl, Han Guoxiu, a look. Unfortunately, the girl did not understand at all. When Sima Qian estimated that his eyelids were about to ache, she finally flew into a rage. If you have something to say, say it. The old man coughed and scolded with a straight face, Guoxiu, speak properly. The girl said in a muffled voice, then turned to Sima Qian and made a signature hand gesture that said, See if I don't beat you to death. The old man looked forward and said slowly, You guys, don't guess blindly. Wait a moment. As long as you look back, you'll know why the Beimang cavalry took the initiative to retreat. Apart from Su Huang and Song Xinsheng, who needed to drive carefully, everyone turned to look. The old man laughed and said, I, Han Guzi, am just a person who doesn't live up to my name. Compared to the young man who might make the entire Beimang avoid him in the future, I've lived for so many years in vain. But even so, I'm happy. Sima Qian, Lu Duanmao, Jean Baosher, Han Guoxiu, Qi Zihu, and Lu Shouwen all turned to look in that direction, but they only saw that the cavalry was galloping in the opposite direction. The old man closed his eyes and leisurely hummed a song that he had accidentally heard in the marketplace of Yuzhou. At that time, a little girl sang it when she bought green ant wine for her father. Her childish voice was clear and crisp. Perhaps she could buy some food with the little money she had left after buying the wine, but the innocent child seemed very happy when she sang. But at this moment, the yellow sand outside the Great Wall and the strong wind on the long river sounded particularly sorrowful and desolate when the old man hummed with a hoarse voice. Spring returns, yellow orioles fly on the branches. Autumn returns, wild geese return to the city. Year after year, I've waited for many years. Biyao Saber master, wrapped in horse hide, returned. Han Guoxiu, who had waited for a long time but still did not get an answer, felt her neck ache. Finally, she could not help but complain that her grandfather was lying. Everyone suddenly widened their eyes at the same time. In the distance, there was a line of peerless cavalry, like a snow-white tide, surging over. Sima Can said in shock, "Is it the great snow dragon cavalry?" Su Huang did not turn around, and said in a deep voice, "It's the white horse cavalry." Han Guzi opened his eyes, thinking back to those years, the invincible elite soldiers of Great Qin. Every time there was a war, there would be two words that would resound through the sky. Su Huang closed his eyes, as if he was imagining the scene of the tiger and wolf army with irresistible force. He laughed softly, "The wind rises." Sima Can, who was familiar with history books, murmured, "The wind rises." While Han Guoxiu was shocked behind him, Jean Baosher suddenly turned her horse around. Her whole body was trembling, and she shouted at the back of the figure, "Biyao. The wind rises." Han Guzi exhaled softly, and laughed loudly. 800 years ago, the wind rose in Great Qin. But how can the era that I, Han Guzi, live and be inferior? Because 800 years later, Biyao would fight to the death. Chapter 1500. Su Fengnian, escorted by 800 white horses, did not follow the original plan to go straight to Huda City so that he could be deployed in the Huayang Pass Protectorate. Instead, he was called to a place further south, where the northern Liang Path could be called a beautiful scenery. The water was abundant, the mountains were steep, and the geography was good. Naturally, it could not escape the eyes of the military. It was here that Biyao was going to build a city more majestic than Huda City. Giant trees from the depths of the Nanzhao Mountains in West Shu, which had been stored in Biyao for many years, and countless giant stones that had almost hollowed out the mountain peaks of Lanyu were transported along the wide road. Under the orders of the young lord, with the prince's mansion in Mount Qingliang as the center, the 3 provincial governors' mansions and the garrisons in various places as the main force, almost the entire Biyao except for Liuzhou was affected by this new city. It was as if the majestic qi in the body of a master began to circulate rapidly. Su Fengnian personally assumed the temporary position of general master craftsman, administrator Li Gongda and a master of Moism acted as governors, and 6 people, including the Liangzhou provincial governor Wang Peifang, who was half a rank higher among the 4 provincial governors, and Wang Linquan, who used to be the god of wealth in Qingzhou, acted as deputy supervisors who participated in specific affairs. In one breath, all the garrison troops in the south of Liangzhou's border and hundreds of thousands of soldiers under the age of 50 were stationed here. The construction was in full swing. Now, in Biyao, the only person who could give orders to Su Fengnian was Su Weisheng, who had just been conferred the title of Princess Fujing by the Liang imperial court. In the twilight of the setting sun, Su Fengnian and Su Weisheng, as well as several powerful governors and deputy supervisors, slowly walked along the river. The master of Moism who came out of Mount Qingliang with Liuzhou provincial governor Yang Guangdo was temporarily unable to leave. Of course, administrator Li Gongda, who was also one of the governors, had to be present to explain the construction process of the new city to the young lord. In the past few years, Li Gongda could be said to have tasted the taste of life. First, he was promoted to the second-rank administrator and became the top border official in the Liang dynasty. Then, before he could even sit down, he encountered the turbulent situation of Beiyao's change of dynasty. Sure enough, Su Beiji took away his title of Lingzhou provincial governor without saying anything. Then, Song Dongming became the deputy administrator who did not follow the etiquette system and was stationed in Mount Qingliang. In the eyes of the officialdom of Biyao, it was naturally the new Prince Liang's doing for the sake of checks and balances. However, just when everyone mistakenly thought that Li Gongda would soon pack up his things and leave, the young lord immediately appointed Li Gongda as the governor of the new city. The desolate scene of the administrator's mansion in the early spring of the second year of Jianghu was still vivid in the minds of the officialdom of Lingzhou. Now, many officials began to regret that they did not take advantage of the cold stove. And after Li Gongda rushed here, he was like a different person from before. He ate and slept in the open with the big son of the Mo family. As a result, even Tian Peifong, who cared the most about health, suffered a lot. Li Gongda's mouth was dry from talking, so he casually took the water bottle mixed with a lot of herbal medicine from his waist and took a sip. Then he sighed with emotion. Your Highness, I've been a local official in Biyao for most of my life, and I've been racking my brains to figure out how to be an official. Even when I got into the carriage after leaving, I was just secretly glad that Your Highness didn't forget me. At that time, when I lifted the curtain and saw the armored cavalry guards sent by Your Highness, and then looked at the flattering faces outside the carriage again, I felt very satisfied, as if I had personally slapped them. Although Tian Peifong was the high-ranking provincial governor of Liangzhou, she was still not qualified to walk side by side with Su Fengmian, Li Gongda, and the others. She could only keep a few steps behind them. Because the administrator didn't deliberately hide his voice, Tian Peifong heard everything. After thinking about it, she really admired this old guy who was the best at being an official in Biyao. Official Li's skill of making use of every opportunity was really perfect. Moreover, he didn't hesitate to tarnish his image and poured out his heart and lungs. He really understood the essence of attracting favor and securing favor. Tian Peifong felt that she had benefited a lot. She felt that listening to a gentleman's words is better than reading for 10 years. Li Gongda turned his head to look north at the address of the new city and said softly with a smile, "Back then, I forced myself to agree to Hanlon's request to join the army at the border. In fact, at the beginning, I only wanted this precious son of mine to muddle along in the border army. Relying on his father's connections, it was enough for him to become a commandant. When he returned to his hometown and returned to a place where his father's words were still effective, he would have a meteoric rise. In the future, whether he was a general or a provincial governor, it was better than fighting desperately on the border. Therefore, when I heard that this boy secretly became a white horse crossbowman, I was really scared out of my wits. When I heard that Li Hanlon had actually followed the Longxiang army to attack Gusai province and even acted as a scout to open the way, as his father, when did I not burn incense and pray to Buddha during that time? Therefore, when Hanlon, this boy, came back home alive and well with those young men who he treated as his life and death brothers, I, Li Gongda, wanted to scold him, but I couldn't bear to do so. I liked the greedy and cowardly Li Gongda who amassed wealth. How did he give birth to such a son? When Li Gongda said this, the pride on his face was particularly strong. He laughed loudly and said, "How did I give birth to such a son that even I feel ashamed of?" Li Gongda, who was so busy that his lips were full of bloody blisters, paused for a moment. Therefore, when this brat, who had been extravagant since he was young, suddenly said that he wanted to use the money he earned from killing the Beimang barbarians to invite me to the best restaurant in Lingzhou for a drink, I felt very comfortable. I, Li Gongda, am at ease. It's even more comfortable than being the Northern Liangdao administrator of my dreams. Su Fengmian said softly, "Hanlon has already been promoted from a crossbowman to a captain. Back then, when I advised him to join the army, it was actually the same as Uncle Li's. I just wanted him to go to the border to calm down so that he wouldn't have nothing to do in Lingzhou and cause trouble all day long. At that time, the one in the most difficult position would definitely be Uncle Li, who had just become the new administrator. I also didn't expect Hanlon to be reborn and become a top-class elite soldier in the Biyao frontier army on his own." Li Gongda suddenly lowered his voice and said hoarsely, "To be honest, if I could go back on my words, I still wouldn't want Hanlon to join the army. After all, I only have one son. If he's gone, then he's gone. Who will take care of me when I'm old? Do you still want me to send you off? Even if I, Hanlon, am a wastrel who doesn't amount to much, in the eyes of a father, as long as I'm alive, it's better than anything else. But there's no medicine for regret in the world. Since Hanlon has come to this step, no matter how much I, Li Gongda, fear and trepidation every day, I can only do my best and leave the rest to fate. Li Gongda was the first to stop and turn around. Looking at the city, he muttered, I, Biyao, want to build tall buildings here and let this city dominate the border. I, Li Gongda, don't say anything about working for the Biyao Frontier Army. I just want to use this opportunity to do it personally and let my son, who is fighting on the front lines, have more support. A father's love was like a mountain. All the fathers in the world were their son's support. From beginning to end, from old age to death. Li Gongda, who had lost his composure, laughed at himself. Your Highness, I'll go back to work first. Otherwise, I'll be sprayed with saliva by that bad-tempered master of the Mo family. Su Fengnian smiled and agreed. After the administrator, who had the highest official position, left, Wang Linquan, Tian Peifong, and the other deputy supervisors took his place. Wang Linquan, in particular, had a special status. Not only had he been Su Zhao's lackey when he was young, but his daughter, Wang Chudong, was destined to be one of the future concubines of Biyao. However, because of the hasty death of the old Prince Liang, this joyous event had been delayed in Mount Qingliang. Now, in Biyao, there were 2 in-laws in Biyao Palace. It was reasonable to say that the children of the Lu family, who came from a powerful family in Qingzhou, should be more outstanding. However, as time went by, the result was unexpected. The Wang family, which was full of the stench of money, stood out. The Lu family, however, seemed to be not acclimatized. Almost no young children were appointed as officials with real power in Biyao. The current head of the family, Lu Dongjiang, who was the best at calligraphy, was even more depressed. It was said that after several disturbances, this Lu Chuke had an irreconcilable conflict with his daughter, Lu Qingyan. Regarding this, the officials in Biyao had different opinions. Originally, they were betting on the Wang family and the Lu family equally. However, after Wang Linquan became the deputy supervisor of the new city, and Lu Dongjiang did not have the opportunity to take up this position, the situation completely changed. However, perhaps because Mount Qingliang did not want to embarrass the Lu family too much, one of Lu Dongjiang's nephews became the manager in charge of the construction of the new city's provisions. Unlike the unattainable but temporary deputy supervisor, in Biyao, this was an official position that could easily be promoted. At this moment, this child of the Lu family was closely following more than 20 steps away. Most of the men of the Lu family were elegant, and this person was no exception. Today, he deliberately took off his official robe and put on a brand new bright brocade robe. In the group, he looked particularly outstanding. There were several scholars of similar age with him. Chapter 1501. In fact, Su Fengnian recognized this person at a glance. He was Lu Qingyan's cousin, Lu Qingsong. He was one of the most outstanding talents in the Lu family of Qingzhou. However, Su Fengnian felt a little helpless about this person standing out from the crowd. When one enters a village, one must follow the local customs. This was the most simple principle. Being a crane in a flock of chickens meant that it was incompatible. In the officialdom, who was not in harmony with the light and the dust. It was a taboo to have this kind of edge. After all, it was a completely different field from the scholarly and literary world, which emphasized high standards and elegance. Su Fengnian sighed in his heart. After chatting with his father-in-law, Wang Linquan, he deliberately turned around and stopped to look at Lu Qingsong, who was still 3 rows away from him. The people present were all old foxes in the officialdom. They quickly made way for him. Lu Qingsong, who had been paying attention to the young lord's movements, quickly understood and walked forward confidently. After a few steps, he suddenly turned around and looked back. Then, a young scholar hesitantly walked out of the line and followed Lu Qingsong. This presumptuous action made all the officials, including Tian Peifong, a little unhappy in their hearts. Those who were less cultured had already frowned. Lu Qingsong was just a small 7th-level manager. It was fine that he relied on the special identity of the Lu family to have an audience with the prince, but what right did he have to bring an outsider? Su Fengnian turned a blind eye to this. After Lu Qingsong bowed, he asked with a smile, "Uncle Lu, are you well?" After Lu Qingsong straightened his back, he did not bend down again. This small action made the nearby officials feel even more disgusted. Under the influence of the general, Northern Liang would not deliberately abide by the rule that the emperor should not be looked up to, and the vassals should not be looked at the same level. Naturally, those who violated the rule would not be so exaggerated as to need to stab themselves in the eyes as an apology. However, the arrogance that came from Lu Qingsong's bones was really too disgusting. Lu Qingsong still acted as if there was no one around. He said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner, "Uncle is well. Every day at home, he writes more than 10 pieces of calligraphy." Even Tian Peifong could not help but roll her eyes. This guy's words had a hidden meaning. Did he mean that Lu Qingsong had to pretend to be leisurely because he could not fulfill his ambitions? Tian Peifong narrowed her eyes as she stared at the young face she had seen at the banquet. She had the urge to swear. Others might not know, but as the provincial governor of Liangzhou, he knew very well. At the time, the king had intended for Lu Dongjiang to be the governor of Liangzhou, but the head of the Lu family did not want to be an assistant. He was unhappy and refused. The king then suggested that he be the mountain master of the White Horse Academy, which was as famous as the Green Deer Cave Academy. Lu Dongjiang was still not happy. At the time, Tian Peifong felt a little guilty for occupying the position of provincial governor of Liangzhou, so she personally set up a banquet to invite Lu Qingsong. In the end, none of the men of Lu Dongjiang's generation from the Lu family showed up. Only Lu Qingsong and the other young people who had not even grown hair yet entered the manor. On the other hand, Wang Linquan, who had the same status as Lu Dongjiang, was also a relative of the Qingliang mountain imperial family. When had he not been amiable when he met people? What's wrong with being a scholar? I, Tian Peifong, was a scholar that even Yao Baifeng praised a few words. Could it be that only scholars in Qingzhou with the surname Lu were precious in the world, while scholars in Beiliang were worthless? In the imperial court of Liang, among the older generation, there was Yao Baifeng, who was in charge of the imperial college, and Yan Jieshi, the grand secretary of the palace pavilion. Among the younger generation, not to mention that ungrateful wretch Jean Lanting, there was also Chen Wang, who was already in the central government, and Sun Yin, who was famous in the capital. Su Fengnian said pleasantly, "Now that there is a deputy administrator in Yidao, it's a rule of the imperial court. Deputy Administrator Song has been complaining to me about the heavy workload and that he can't handle it alone. After all, Beiliang is different from other places. It shouldn't be difficult to ask the imperial court for a legitimate deputy administrator." Lu Qingsong, who heard the implied meaning, couldn't help but be excited. However, he immediately glanced at Wang Linquan, who was standing next to Su Fengnian, but the latter didn't move. Then Lu Qingsong introduced him to Su Fengnian. "Your Highness, this is Zhang Huanji, who is very famous in Jiangnan scholarly circles. He is skilled in zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting, especially his paintings of mountains and rivers far and near. Moreover, if Zhang Huanji were to take part in the imperial examination, he would definitely take the top 3. Therefore, he gave up his bright future and came to Beiliang alone." Compared to the famous and distinguished Lu Qingsong, the young scholar named Zhang Huanji was much more reserved. He bowed respectfully and said, "Zhang Huanji greets your highness with fear and trepidation." Tian Peifong carefully observed the prince's expression. As long as the prince showed a trace of dissatisfaction, he could let this young man named Zhang Huanji sit on the bench in Beiliang's officialdom for a long time. Su Fengnian had already sized up Zhang Huanji. After hearing what he said, he smiled and said, "It's been hard on you." Zhang Huanji was stunned. He lowered his head and said in a trembling voice, "I don't dare. After I arrived in Beiliang, I saw and heard with my own eyes. Only then did I realize that Beiliang is very different from what I remembered." Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile and turned to continue walking. Not long after, he had Tian Peifong, Wang Linquan, and the others go back to work. He only walked side by side with Su Weisheng on the riverside. Not far away was the white horse in charge of guarding. Su Fengnian asked softly. Xianyuan Qingfeng took the initiative to contact the Fu Shui room? Su Wisheng nodded and said, at that time, Xueping first contacted Lu Nerong of the Fish Dragon Gang. Wutong'an and the Fu Shui room were a little rushed, so we planted many Jianghu spies among the three people. At the same time, we also moved the men of sacrifice of the Fu Shui room back to Biyao. They are in charge of spreading rumors. Su Fengnian smiled and said, no wonder Xianyuan Qingfeng said he wanted to fight me and make me lose to him. If I knew about this, I would have agreed. This is a big favor. Su Wisheng asked, after you met Sir and the others, how did it go? Su Fengnian shook his head and said, after all, Sir is still the Chancellor of Shangyin Academy. His every move is involuntary. Being able to come to Biyao has already crossed the bottom line of the Liang Zhao clan. I guess Qi Yanglong will soon come up with a countermeasure in the capital and spread the news. Once Sir Han returns from his travels, he will take over the position of Grand Chancellor. Chapter 1502. Su Wisheng turned his wheelchair and stopped in front of the river. He sighed softly. When Sir deliberately didn't enter Liangzhou, I knew that he had made up his mind. If Sir had entered the city, we would have been disappointed, because this would mean that Sir had no desires and would bring all the disciples back to the school. Since he had shown it to the Liang imperial court, it meant that at least one disciple would secretly stay in Biyao. Su Fengnian was pleasantly surprised. Su Huang, Sima Can. It would be good if one of them stayed. Su Wisheng probably remembered the years when he studied in Shangyin Academy and was a little absent-minded. Su Fengnian said softly, don't worry, Sir is still very healthy. He rode a horse for 10 miles. Su Wisheng looked up and glared. You didn't stop him? Su Fengnian rolled his eyes. At that time, Sir wanted me to send them 20 miles. I was in a hurry to get to Huayang Pass. Plus, Su Huang and the others were desperately trying to stop me, so I didn't say anything. Speaking of this, Su Fengnian smirked and said, in the end, old Mr. only asked me to accompany you for 10 miles. Although he said it was my intention, I think old Mr. really couldn't take it anymore. Su Wisheng's lips curled up. Su Fengnian squatted down beside the wheelchair and rubbed his temples. He sighed. Why is the Lu family so stupid? Could it be that the intelligence of the entire clan was concentrated on the old consecrator Lu Feiqi and Lu Qingyan? Wang Linquan isn't someone who's easy to deal with either. Although he's been watching from the sidelines, he's still kind enough to not kick the Lu family when they're down. But at the very least, we're still a family. If Wang Linquan can take a step back, Mount Qingliang will be much safer. Su Wisheng asked calmly, so you deliberately propose to let Lu Dongjiang be the useless deputy administrator to beat Wang Linquan? Su Fengnian said bitterly, you can say that I'm beating around the bush. However, if I continue to ignore the Lu family, I'm afraid that in less than 3 or 4 years, the local officials of Biyao will eat up the Lu family until not even their bones are left. Even my Wutong'an is secretly selling calligraphy, paintings, and antiques in exchange for salt, iron, and food from other places. This Lu family, on the other hand, has bought more than 30 calligraphy and paintings with the old consecrator's hard-earned savings. Since they have no choice but to take root in Biyao, it would be good even if they followed Wang Linquan's example and bought land at a low price from the other families that have moved out of Biyao. Was this the time to pretend to be cultured? Each one of them is feeling complacent, thinking that they have taken advantage of the world. Su Wisheng suddenly gloated. Actually, you underestimated Wang Linquan's conduct. Since the beginning of spring, this god of wealth has quietly bought a number of priceless calligraphy and paintings at a low price. He should be lowering his status to give them to the Lu family. As soon as you opened your mouth, you casually threw out a second-rank deputy administrator. Wang Linquan can't give them away. Otherwise, not only will the Lu family not care, they will also be looked down upon by the old Lu Dongjiang and the young Lu Qingsong. Su Fengnian was vexed. Sister, why didn't you say this earlier? Su Wisheng beamed. It's my fault. Su Fengnian immediately raised his hands. I acted abruptly. Su Wisheng sneered. Abruptly? Does our king of Biyao act abruptly? Otherwise, why would he fight with the second most powerful person in the world, Tuoba Bodhisattva, all the way from the northern part of the western regions to Snow Lotus City? He fought to his heart's content and turned the world upside down. It was truly awe-inspiring. I was thinking of getting someone to make a plaque with the words #1 in the world, and hanging it at the gate of Mount Qingliang. If you think the words #1 in the world are tacky, how about invincible in the world? Isn't it more domineering? Su Fengnian knew his second sister's temperament, so he didn't dare to refute her. He pulled a blade of grass from the ground with a frown, flicked the soil away, and held it in his mouth. Su Fengnian suddenly sighed. Biyao is so big, so many aspects. Even a dog would hate to be the head of the household for 3 years. Su Weisheng reached out and slapped him heavily on the head. Who's the dog? Su Fengnian said helplessly, didn't I want to say the second half of my sentence? I just wanted to say that it wasn't easy for our father to be the head of the household. Su Weisheng looked at the sky and whispered softly, yes. Su Fengnian, who was originally squatting, simply sat on the ground and slowly chewed on the blade of grass. For some reason, Su Weisheng thought of a song that had never been circulated. Back then, she and his sister were married off to Jiangnan. That day, there was a young man in the Wutangan, knocking his chopsticks on a wine bowl. Seeing you off for 1,000 miles, until the steep mountains become flat plains. Parting with sorrow, please drink 6, 2, 3. 1 tael, may you bring an umbrella when it rains in Jiangnan. 2 taels, may you gently fan yourself in the heat. 3 taels, may you not forget to put on more clothes when winter comes. 4 taels, may you spend more time together every year. 5 taels, may you be free from illness and worry, and always happy. 6 taels, may you be happy without wind or rain. 6, 2, 3. 3 taels left. I am in the northwest, one pass after another. Separated from you, one mountain after another. Finally, may I know that you are safe. Su Weisheng let out a long breath, turned his head and said softly, don't do stupid things in the future. You will make father, mother, and your sister worry. Su Fengnian made a sound of agreement, then spat out the blade of grass. He looked into the distance and said softly, Tuoba Bodhisattva has gone to Liuzhou, and Huang Manor is there. I am just worried. Su Weisheng lowered his head, and his expression could not be seen clearly. The breeze blew, and the hair on his forehead rose and fell. Su Fengnian smiled and stood up. Sister, I am going to Huayang Pass. While Tuoba Bodhisattva is not at the border, I will personally go to Huda City. Sister, don't worry, this time I will not act on impulse. As long as the situation is not good, I will retreat. Su Weisheng raised his head and said in confusion, call me second sister. Su Fengnian scratched his head. It's all the same. Su Weisheng waved his hand. Go, when you reach Huda City, twist hundreds and thousands of Beimang heads off. Su Fengnian laughed. You said it yourself. 3 days later, at dusk, when a figure appeared on the city wall of Huda City, the Beimang army that had been attacking the city day and night for more than a month suddenly retreated. For the first time, they had a truce. Looking at that person from afar, the Beimang army was terrified. At dawn the next day, a strong wind blew. The king of the northern court, Dongzhua, only dared to take 100 steps out of the formation under the protection of the Beimang armored guards. He looked at the city wall of Huda City and did not say any heroic words. He only raised his arm high and then waved it down heavily. Thus, the most tragic battle in the second year of Jianghu began. Chapter 1503. Yesterday, Su Fengnian had rushed to the top of the city wall from the south without any warning and intruded into Huda City alone. Not to mention the Beimang army, even Lu Jinu and the other Biyao soldiers looked at each other in dismay when they heard the news. When Su Fengnian had rushed all the way from Huayang Pass to Huda City, a Beimang martial arts master who had temporarily acted as a stable in the south of Huda City simply abandoned his horse and ran madly toward the main camp. Then, the Beimang's momentum of attacking the city suddenly slowed down and retreated like the tide. This night, Su Fengnian stood on the blood-stained north city wall of Huda City. The Huda City's main general and lieutenant he had drunk with last time had lost two of their faces. The careless Ma Jili was dead, and the elegant Chu Hanqing was also dead. When they left, they were in the prime of their lives. From Lu Jinu's calm narration with a hoarse voice and not much emotional fluctuation, Su Fengnian learned that the 3,000 elite cavalrymen who could wear heavy armor and fight as heavy cavalry and the 6,000 light cavalrymen in the city were still intact. However, 8,000 of the 24,000 regular infantrymen and nearly 10,000 auxiliary soldiers had died in battle. When Su Fengnian had asked how many wounded soldiers there were, Lu Jinu had only said that there were not many wounded soldiers. Su Fengnian was silent. In fact, he had known the cruel answer in Huayang Pass. The north, northeast, and northwest sides of Huda's city were Beimang's three main attack fronts. Lu Jinu had accurately divided the city into 32 defensive lines, with each lieutenant leading their own defense. If the Beimang barbarians managed to reach the top of the city wall and could not retreat within 30 minutes, Lu Jinu had to mobilize other forces to support them. Then, the main general would be dismissed on the spot and become an ordinary soldier. The deputy would take his place, and so on. In the past 2 months, a total of 7 lieutenants had died in battle. The reason why Lieutenant Chu Hanqing had died in battle was because the 3 senior captains under his command had died one after another in just 2 hours. This was the first time that Tiger Head City had a situation where more than 600 enemies were continuously pouring in. The key point was that the defensive lines seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. Furious, Lu Jinu asked the sentries to send a message to Chu Hanqing, who was already covered in blood, saying, "If you really can't defend the city, just say the word. I, Lu Jinu, will personally lead people to help." Beimang, who had finally found a breakthrough, began to frantically mobilize their troops. When Lu Jinu rushed to the battlefield with 800 personal guards and killed off the Beimang barbarians, Chu Hanqing, who had countless corpses at his feet, was sitting in a pool of blood at the foot of the wall. His face had been chopped beyond recognition. If it were not for the bright armor that the general had personally bestowed upon him for his military service, no one would have recognized this corpse as Lieutenant Chu, who had a pair of exceptionally beautiful daughters. He was the Bailiang seed who had been persuaded by the general several times to go to Tai and city to take the imperial examinations and become a scholar. Before dawn, Su Fengnian turned his head and looked along the horse path that the Bailiang frontier army liked to call the city wall. The corpses on both sides had been removed last night, so the people who appeared on the city wall at this moment were all living people. This seemed like nonsense, but in fact, it was not. As long as ordinary people did not have any illness or difficulties, they might need 40 to 50 years to lie in a coffin. But here, they might go from the world of the living to the netherworld in an instant, and there would not be many coffins to lie in. Su Fengnian looked away and said to Lu Jinu, who was about to return to the tall building in the city to pay attention to the first-hand battle situation, "General Lu, at present, I can only make a rough judgment based on the Qi cultivators of the Guanyin sect. I know that Tuoba Bodhisattva has come south from Shijing and will arrive at the border between Gusai and Liuzhou in about half a day. Therefore, Dongjua urgently stopped the attack to let the scouts pass on the military information to Tuoba Bodhisattva. The great Grandmaster Qi cultivator Tantai Pingjing is not in Bailiang now, so I can't accurately know Tuoba Bodhisattva's whereabouts. Therefore, I can only stay in Huda City for another 2 days and 1 night at most. To be honest, the outcome of the battle between me and Tuoba Bodhisattva is 50-50. Whoever makes a move later will definitely win. Therefore, I can't let Tuoba Bodhisattva notice the flow of Qi too early. In the early stage, I can only suppress the battle, probably at the Xian stage, at most at the celestial stage. At the worst, I have to wait until Dongzhua's scouts pass on the military information to Tuoba Bodhisattva. Only then can I kill the most people. Lu Jinu hesitated for a moment. "Actually, Your Highness only needs to appear in Huda City, you don't have to take the risk." Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "Huda City doesn't need me, Su Fengnian, to wave the flag and shout to boost the morale." Then, Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If that's the case, if I come to Huda's city and don't kill the barbarians, am I supposed to stand on the city wall and be a target for the barbarians? Or pretend to be a master? This is actually more tiring than going to the battlefield to kill the barbarians. Lu Jinhu clenched the hilt of his sword and stared at Su Fengnian. He smiled calmly and said, "The war is imminent. Perhaps it's unlucky and against the rules to say this, but I can't help but say this. Everyone can die except for your highness. If your highness dies, we can't fight in the future." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "General Lu, don't worry. I'm very afraid of death." Lu Jinhu looked at the young lord who probably didn't have time to wear the armor. He turned around and said softly, "Ma Jili has been guarding the front line of the city for more than a month. Originally, he was a burly man of about 180 kilograms. When he died, he was only slightly heavier than your highness by about 10 kilograms. Therefore, your highness could only wear the armor that your highness wore after his death." Everyone in Huda city said that Ma Jili made a fortune. Beimang's siege army began to get into formation. Perhaps it was to welcome Su Fengnian, the king of Biyao. The catapults that had been quiet on the battlefield were all pushed out. Lu Jinhu exhaled heavily. "They're here." Su Fengnian smiled softly and said, "Lend me your sword." Lu Jinhu took off the saber hanging on his waist and tossed it to Su Fengnian. Laughing heartily, he said, "In this life, this general has nothing to worry about. In the past, this cold saber was this general's daughter, nobody could touch it. Today, this daughter is getting married." Lu Jinhu strode away. In Jianghu, it was a moonless and windy night to kill people. On the battlefield, especially in Beiyang's Huda city and the Longyan plain where Beimang's army was stationed, this was not important. When the king of the southern courtyard, Dongzhuo, raised his arm and smashed down, the majestic sound of the bugle horn suddenly sounded. Pitch-black armored torrents slowly surged forward from both sides of Dongzhuo's personal army's phalanx. Because they couldn't bear the burden or had been overused, only 700 or so of the 1,000 northern Mang stone catapults remained. However, most of the large-scale stone catapults were still in good condition. Under this round of neat firing, the might of the catapults still caused one's expression to change. It was like flowing fire that filled the sky. Dongzhuo subconsciously tapped his teeth lightly and looked around. Other than the nearly 1,000 elite personal cavalry and squires of the Dong family, the top Beimang martial arts experts from the three major sects, Tao Dao sect, chess and sword music school, and Princess Grave, were also hidden by him. On the periphery, there were a total of 40 huge ballistae that were said to be able to shoot a sword that was equivalent to the sword of a land sword immortal within 1,000 feet. They were all operated by the strongest person in the army, and the remaining dozen or so chi refinement warriors of the southern dynasty were in charge of aiming. The originally vibrant Beimang martial arts world was almost ruined to such a small extent before the Beiliang was completely defeated. According to Dongzhuo's original plan, he should have piled up all the martial arts experts of Beimang on the central line from the beginning. Together with all the chi refinement warriors, they could be tied together into a rope. Even if you were Su Fengnian or Su Yanbing, could you stop them? Unfortunately, even if he was already the king of the southern courtyard, he still had to take care of all the forces. As a result, he was now in such a messy and pitiful situation. Was it interesting to go through so much trouble to infiltrate Yuzhou to assassinate Yan Wenluan and cause a great loss to his vitality? Dongzhuo curled his lips and raised his head. His gaze followed a huge rock that was smashing towards Huda city and looked at the figure. He said to himself, "Su, come and kill me. Aren't you tempted to take the head of a general in the midst of thousands of soldiers? Anyway, it's still too early for Tuoba Bodhisattva to get here. If you have the ability, you can open up your realm. If you can dodge the rain of flying swords shot out from the ballista, I, Dongzhuo, promise, will definitely escape." Just as Dongzhuo was dilly-dallying by himself, the man on the city wall rose into the air like a dazzling white streak of light. Dongzhuo narrowed his eyes and clicked his tongue. One man once fought against millions of soldiers. The Sword Emperor of West Shu did this kind of shady business. What happened in the end? That guy died under the hooves of your Su family's iron cavalry. Be careful that you don't suffer retribution today. Next to the fat man, there was a valiant young woman who was riding a horse and wearing armor. She frowned and said, "Can you kill with your mouth?" Dong Zhuo put on a straight face and said seriously, "If you never forget, there will be an echo." This fat man's second daughter-in-law was the daughter of Mount Bubang's leader, Diwu Raccoon. Back in Beimang, she had met Dong Zhuo and Su Fengnian once because of the little girl Tao Manwu. But at that time, she never thought that her father would die in the hands of a young man. Even his head was taken back to Biyao. Dong Zhuo suddenly laughed and said, "My Dong army was already on the way to Liuzhou last night. Killing his brother is more interesting than killing Su Fengnian." Chapter 1504. Dong Zhuo was clad in armor and carrying a saber as he sat on a large and majestic steed. The man and horse complemented each other perfectyi. Although Dong Zhuo was fat, he did not appear fat and bloated. Compared to the king of the South Courtyard who controlled half of the Beimang army, Zhao Yi and Zhao Yuang of the Guangling Path were indeed much more lacking in appearance. Dong Zhuo straightened his neck and looked at the white rainbow that had fallen in front of the city. His eyes were shining. He was also a skilled martial artist. Otherwise, he would have been beaten into a skinny man if he had not swindled the daughter of the fifth raccoon of the Bingbing Mountain. Personally, Dong Zhuo did not have a bad impression of Su Fengnian from the opposing camp. When they first met in Beimang, he was the founder of the Dong Army, a separatist force. He was still separated from the current king of the South Courtyard by the great general of the Beimang. It could even be said that if Su Fengnian had not appeared out of nowhere and not only succeeded in usurping the position of the king of Biyao, but also won the hearts of the Biyao cavalry and the hearts of the people of Biyao, then Dong Zhuo would at most be working under Lu Gui or Yang Yuanzang, just like Hong Jingyan and Zhong Tan. In addition, Dong Zhuo owed Su Fengnian a favor because of the incident with Tao Manwu. Therefore, if it was not for the general trend, Dong Zhuo actually wanted to sit down and have a good chat with Su Fengnian. He wanted to learn from the famous scholars of the Central Plains who liked to chat and talk about heroes over wine on a snowy night instead of being in such a situation. In Dong Zhuo's vision, the person was indeed as expected. Because he was afraid of Tuoba Bodhisattva, he did not display the supreme cultivation of the celestial state. Instead, he borrowed weapons from the border army of Huda's city or the armored soldiers of Beimang to block the giant stones thrown by nearly 1,000 catapults. The attacking figure landed in the open space between the two armies. Although he had suppressed his qi and momentum, his momentum was not inferior to the scene of thousands of cavalry charging out of the city. This made Dong Zhuo, who was limited to the Vajra state because of his root bone and fate, could not help but tremble with fear. Fatty Dong said that even the sword emperor of Shishu could not be a match for 10,000 people on the battlefield. However, Dong Zhuo knew that if Su Fengnian did not have the worry of Tuoba Bodhisattva and allowed him to fight freely, the formation of the Beimang siege army, which was mostly infantrymen and only had 2 winged cavalry, would be easily disrupted. Therefore, Dong Zhuo hoped that the great guru would show the magnanimity of an immortal on the land and ignore the fight between the ants under his feet. It would be best if he came alone to find trouble with Dong Zhuo. In this regard, Dong Zhuo had already prepared a response. In addition to the top masters around him and the large ballistae that could shoot the immortal sword of 1,000 feet, Dong Zhuo had also placed many masters who could conceal their qi in the cavalry on both sides. As long as Su Fengnian was deeply trapped in the formation, when he wanted to retreat, it would be easy for them to form a circle around him. Not to mention intercepting and killing Su Fengnian, who was returning to Huda's city. The worst-case scenario would be to consume a large amount of Su Fengnian's essence, qi, and spirit. In this way, they would be able to delay until Tuoba Bodhisattva entered the formation. For this reason, Dong Zhuo had specially asked several grandmasters of Beimang and repeatedly confirmed that after entering the celestial phenomenon state, one would be able to achieve what the Confucians called the heavens perception and be able to resonate with heaven and earth. Then, the qi in the martial artist's body would be like a turbulent river meeting a flood season. It could be said that it was like adding wings to a tiger. However, this kind of behavior that belonged to stealing the qi of heaven and earth had a congenital flaw, that was, God could only add flowers to brocade, but could not provide timely help. Once it involved the consumption of the martial artist's root, it would still be difficult to make up for it in a short period of time. Otherwise, two grandmasters of the celestial phenomenon state would not be able to determine the winner even if they fought until the end of time. In the past, there was an old swordsman named Li Chungang at Liang Lake. He had used 1 qi to break 2,600 armors by the Guangling River. Most of the ordinary people were shocked by the number of the Great Destruction cavalry. However, only those who had reached a higher level in martial arts would understand that the true horror lay in the 2 words, 1 qi. This meant that the old man named Li Chungang did not care about the celestial phenomenon of qi and qi. 1 qi was 1 qi, and 1 sword was 1 sword. Dong Zhuo had made it clear that he wanted to use the lives of hundreds or even thousands of Beimang masters and soldiers to deplete a trace of Su Fengnian's root, just so that the king of the northern courtyard, Tuoba Bodhisattva, could have a better chance of victory. In his line of sight, the streak of white light began to charge in a straight line in a barbaric manner. Dong Zhuo curled his lips and said, if he wasn't the king of Biyao and was just a man of Jianghu, then who in the world would be able to stop him? Being Li Chungang and Chao Chongqing, he's really cool. This guy is really admirable. It's said that those women from the Norland tycoons have all offered money, saying that as long as I capture this unparalleled young king and let them enjoy him once, they would dare to offer 5,000 taels of gold, and the price is negotiable. It's just 1 night of sex. How many sons of the Dong family can I feed with this amount of money? Damn it, I, Dong Zhuo, am only a little fatter and taller than that Su guy. Am I inferior in any way? Why don't you yell at me that just hearing the name Su Fengnian makes my ears pregnant? Fatty Dong's wife coughed a few times when she heard the vulgar words, reminding her man to pay attention to his image in public. Dong Zhuo turned a deaf ear and continued to talk to himself. If it were me, not to mention 5,000 taels of gold, even 500 taels of silver would be fine. His wife, who was already burning with anger, glared at him and said, Dong Zhuo. Fatty Dong shrunk his neck and restrained the frivolous expression that he deliberately showed to reduce his nervousness. He said indifferently, they're here. 1 person, 1 saber. Su Fengnian began to break the formation. After more than a month of bloody siege, the northern Mang barbarians, who grew up on horseback, paid a huge price of more than 20,000 casualties. Facing the towering city wall to the north of Huda City, the northern Mang barbarians, from the captains who had to climb the city wall to the most ordinary soldiers, began to grow rapidly. As they rushed forward, they estimated when the crossbows of the city wall with all kinds of crossbows of northern Liang would shoot out, and they would collectively raise their shields. Of course, they wouldn't stop moving forward. Although it was inevitable that they would slow down their advance and even give the northern young archers on the city wall 1 or 2 more chances to shoot, northern Mang had proven that this seemingly unremarkable little trick could bring unexpected damage reduction effects. After all, the accuracy of the northern Liang's crossbows was too amazing. Even if they were advancing in formation, as long as they dared to ignore the splashing arrows, the northern Liang border army dared to kill them within 300 steps of the city wall in order to reach the city wall sooner. In front of Dong Zhuo's eyes, there were 3 densely packed armored torrents, which were almost mixed with all the siege weapons recorded in military books. The contributions of the southern dynasties couldn't be ignored. There was a battering ram cart pushed by dozens of strong men, a mobile opposite tower as high as the city wall, or even higher than the city wall. The opposite tower was wrapped in special cowhide that could stop rockets, and there were nearly 100 people hiding in it, a hook ladder with pulleys at the bottom, and a trench bridge that was originally only used to level the trench. Under the suggestion of Dong Zhuo's aides in the tent, once they were placed on the city wall, it would be like an artificial slope. At that time, the reason why Beimang was able to send 600 people to the city wall at the same time was because of the 2 trench bridges that turned something rotten into something magical. More than 30,000 infantrymen, and as many as 15,000 in the middle army that was mainly attacking the north side of Tiger Head City. The 2 flanks were slightly less in number, so they attacked the north side of Tiger Head City. Between the 2 gaps formed by the 3 square formations of infantrymen, there were 2 groups of over 1,000 elite cavalry that took the lead to break in, trying their best to suppress the rain of arrows. On the 2 outermost flanks, there were 2 groups of cavalry charging separately. Besides supporting the siege soldiers with their skillful archery skills to prevent the cavalry in Tiger Head City from attacking, They also needed to restrain the cavalry stationed in Huayang Pass from afar to deal with the lightning attacks of the Beiliang cavalry reinforcements that came and went as fast as the wind. According to Zhong Tan's valuable experience in sieging cities at Huluku on the eastern front, the continuous attack on Huda city should be led by about 10 Kiliarchs who were well trained and close to the battlefield. Once there was an emergency situation where a Chiliarch lost 200 or at most 300 men, this troop should immediately withdraw from the battlefield regardless of the outcome. Then, a Chiliarch in the rear should lead the troops to replace them in sieging the city. If these 10,000 men who were eyeing the city covetously found an opportunity on the battlefield, Dong Zhuo would also give them the military power to act as they pleased. They would not need to wait for orders from the commander-in-chief's tent and could immediately send their troops to the battlefield. Those Kiliarchs who were hoping for a fluke and not to make any mistakes, because they missed the opportunity, before they could return to the camp, 2 of them had already been executed by the King of South Courtyard's cavalry. Because of this, 2 of the generals were demoted to Kiliarchs. One of them managed to atone for his crime and eventually led 300 men of sacrifice to attack Huda's city wall. After killing a Beiliang lieutenant surnamed Zhu, he was personally beheaded by Lu Jinu and died on the city wall. His corpse was nailed to the neck by a Beiliang soldier with a flying hook and hung on the city wall. After Beimang took back the badly mutilated corpse, Dong Zhuo personally sent the first generals to die on the Central Front battlefield into a coffin and sent people to transport it back to the Southern Dynasty. At this moment, when the 2 groups of cavalry who were charging ahead saw that lightning-fast figure crash into the Central Army's infantry, some of the cavalry who were proficient in riding and archery received orders from their commander-in-chief, almost simultaneously released a rain of arrows into the empty space in the center. Even though almost all of the cavalry had predicted that person's speed and did not shoot at him but at the area in front of him, they still only saw the arrows land behind that white streak. It was simply too fast. The 2 groups of cavalry no longer wasted the arrows in their bags and continued to charge forward. Chapter 1505. As Su Fengnian charged forward, his left hand lightly rested on the hilt of the saber at his waist. From the top of the city walls, one could instantly see the faces of the soldiers at the very front. It was early in the morning, and these Beimang barbarians were all holding shields, breathing out large mouthfuls of fog. Many of them were in their prime, perhaps having been veterans of Beimang for many years. Perhaps there was still some nervousness in their eyes, but they did not have the slightest bit of confusion that one would have when entering a battle for the first time. This was not strange. Whether it was a cavalry charge against a cavalry charge or a heavy infantry charge against a cavalry charge, the soldiers at the very front were all first-rate elites who were most skilled in battle and were not afraid to die. This was because what they were doing was precisely rushing to their deaths. Beiliang defended the city with crossbows, then crossbows, and then crossbows. These 3 axes had already made Beimang's infantry suffer greatly in both Crouching Bao City and Sheguang City. And among those first crossbows, there was a sense of hierarchy based on the weight of the crossbow. Ballista, Big Yellow Ballista, and Fanning Ballista. These were the 3 most famous heavy ballista of the Northern Liang Border Army. Under the control of the ballista, the ballista, the ballista, and the ballista, bolts were shot out one after another. Before Su Fengnian broke into Beimang's battle formation, bolts shot out from the top of the city walls behind him. The bolts were tied to the bowstrings, completely capable of piercing through a horseman and his horse. The bolts were as large as spears. One of the bolts flew over Su Fengnian's head and struck a moving building, directly piercing through it. The huge bolt did not stop there, carrying the blood of the corpses within the building with it. It landed in the infantry formation behind the building, shooting a soldier who had mistakenly thought that he was lucky enough to be hiding behind something so that he could at least die a little later. The bolt pierced a large hole through his chest and shield. The terrifying penetrative force caused the soldier to die before he could even feel the pain. Su Fengnian instantly pulled out his cold saber, breaking the formation by himself. Facing Su Fengnian head-on, Beimang's foot soldiers on the front line, several soldiers who were responsible for shielding the archers behind them from the rain of arrows slowly raised their shields. Su Fengnian pierced through the Beimang soldier's shield and body at the same time, and the 2 halves flew to the sides. In this straight line, the shield bearers at the front and the archers at the back all exploded into a bloody mist without exception. For some unknown reason, compared to those who died in the vertical direction, those who died in the horizontal direction died silently. Perhaps they were stabbed by a mysterious object that was as hard to detect as a thin needle. Perhaps they were stabbed by an imperceptible red dot from their temples. Perhaps they were stabbed from one shoulder to the other, or perhaps they were stabbed through their hearts. Their deaths were inexplicable and not shocking at all. Only when their corpses fell to the ground would some blood slowly flow out from their wounds. The figure who broke through the thick formation was already far behind the corpses. With an astonishing speed that ordinary martial artists could not reach with their naked eyes, the childhood sweetheart Huang Tong madly spun around the 4 prefectures of its master. 4 flying swords rose into the air. It was as if a sharp weapon had drawn out a bloody groove on his skin. After Su Fengnian broke through the formation 160 steps in one go, his figure paused for a moment. He raised his head and looked over. As expected, there were already 3 Northern Mang martial way experts who had moved upon hearing the scent of blood nearby. Even further away, there was also a group of experts rushing over in succession. However, Bei Mang's foot soldiers did not slow down because of this. They brushed past him amidst the deafening sound of the war drums. When Su Fengnian arrived at Huda City and saw Bei Mang's extremely orderly retreat, he already felt that it was very difficult to deal with. At the same time, he admired Lu Jinu of Huda City even more for his ability to defend the city. Su Fengnian seized the moment when the leading blade-wielding expert hacked downwards to leisurely and carefree shake of his wrist. It looked like he was casually shaking off the blood on his cold blade, but because of that wave of fierce aura, the corpses of those Northern Mang armored soldiers to his left flew outwards in large amounts. The master wielding a sword was not afraid of death. He poured all of his qi into the sword that he thought had reached the realm of perfection. There was a light green gang qi at the tip of the sword. It was obvious that he had an extraordinary cultivation level that only a level 2 master could have. While the master who was determined to die attracted Su Fengnian's attention, there were 2 people on his left and right who suddenly sped up. One of them was a burly man who was barehanded. He suddenly pounced forward after descending from the sky. On the other hand, the short old man to the right of Su Fengnian closed his mouth tightly. He placed one hand on his chest and the other hand behind his back like a long spear. He bent his back and rushed towards the young man who was one of the 4 masters in the world. The exuberant killing intent that instantly erupted made those trembling Northern Mang ordinary soldiers who didn't even look sideways feel a wave of chilliness all over their bodies. That master who jumped down from high up and slashed down like a hot knife through butter suddenly opened his eyes wide. The old guy, in his hand, which he had relied on for half of his life and could be considered a heavy weapon among sabers, was actually casually extended a hand to that young man and casually grasped the blade's edge. At the same time, the brawny man who had hammered out with his fists seemed to have suffered a heavy blow. His tall and sturdy body paused for a moment before he gritted his teeth and continued to charge forward. Then, a series of faint yet continuous sounds came from his chest. This Jianghu martial artist who had been conscripted into the army was indeed a tough man. In the pitiful situation where his entire chest was almost riddled with holes from the 4 flying swords, he still tried to smash his fists onto the young man. However, the distance between them was only 7 or 8 steps. It felt like they were so close but so far away. After his body was hit 4 times, not only was blood flowing from his chest, his face was also bleeding. He staggered and could only sway. That punch that used up all of his vitality was still weak and powerless. It was like he was trying to touch the shoulder of his opponent. The burly man's eyes were filled with unwillingness. He fell to the ground and died. In the end, he didn't even touch the corner of that person's clothes. Before the burly man died, the master who attacked Su Fengnian lost his weapon. Su Fengnian casually slapped his chest and sent him flying. Chapter 1506. The short old man didn't care about the deaths of the 2 people. He turned his body, and his feet kicked up a cloud of yellow sand and dust on the ground. In the blurry vision, the old man's hand that was holding the spear flew out a sinister hidden weapon that he was famous for. A white light also flew out from the palm of the hand that was originally on his chest. After 2 light tinkling sounds, the motionless Su Fengnian grabbed the old man's head with one hand and slowly lifted it up. The old man, whose mouth was tightly shut, didn't struggle at all. He smiled ferociously at the young man in front of him and spat out the real killing move hidden under his tongue. The thin old man, who had spent his whole life to learn half of the finger mysterious realm, had the tip of his tongue as the tip of his sword. Therefore, he had the nickname, Sword-Spitting Elder, in the Jianghu and diabolism of Beimang. Countless masters of the same realm had died under his unexpected, flying sword. Unfortunately, before the old man died, he saw an incredible scene. The half-inch flying sword that he had nurtured for many years hovered in the air between the two people. Before the old man's head was pressed down by Su Fengnian and turned into a pile of meat paste, he could vaguely see that there was a real flying sword in front of his half-baked flying sword. The Saber master, who was sent flying by Su Fengnian but was surprised to find that he wasn't seriously injured, suddenly felt a sharp pain in his chest before he could sigh with emotion. After falling to the ground, he found that there was a crossbow arrow that was almost as big as an iron spear in his chest. On the city wall of Wuxia City, a crossbowman fiercely slapped the back of the head of the ballista leader who was sweating in fear. The ballista leader, who had been paying attention to the situation below the city wall, said angrily, "Damn it, Jiang Wensheng. Are you a spy sent by the barbarians of Beimang? It's fine if you can't shoot the enemy, but how come you almost hurt our prince? Just 4 or 5 steps away. Do you still want to be a crossbowman? All right, scram to the side. I'll do it myself." The crossbowman from Wuxia City named Jiang Wensheng was young, but because of his outstanding eyesight and amazing eyesight, he had already been ranked as one of the most valiant crossbowmen in the border army. At this moment, he had a long face and did not even dare to fart. The head of the standard was about to push away the little bastard who had almost caused trouble, but when he saw the hastily bandaged wound on the young man's face, he stopped. Half a month ago, a Beimang barbarian archer shot an arrow into his cheek. Fortunately, he dodged quickly, but the arrowhead still tore off a large chunk of his flesh. These days, he had been laughed at by the other people in the competition. They said that he was ugly to begin with, and now that his face was disfigured, it would be even harder for him to find a wife. The head of the standard was severely lacking in manpower, so he didn't pretentiously ask the kid if he could continue shooting crossbows. Jiang Wensheng also didn't embarrass them, so he gritted his teeth and never left the city wall. However, the head of the standard knew that the young man couldn't sleep well even after taking turns to rest and sleep. Such a large chunk of flesh had been cut off from his face, how could it not hurt? At this time, a crossbowman shouted with all his might, "Head of the standard, look!" It wasn't just the standard. The crossbowmen nearby all opened their eyes wide. In the distance, the figure on the battlefield put away his cold knife and pulled out the arrow from the corpse on the ground. It was as if he was going to use it as a metal spear to continue attacking the enemy. The crossbowmen near the city wall were resentful. Son of AB*TCH, the standard was really going to be arrogant today. The head of the standard chuckled and slapped Jiang Wensheng's head again. "Does it still hurt?" The young soldier grinned and accidentally pulled on his wound. He immediately grimaced, smiling brightly as he gasped, "Hurt my ass." The head of the standard looked around and roared, "What are you daydreaming about? When the enemy is 200 steps away, the arqueballistas are still the same. The rest of you, switch to foot crossbows. Just ride the northern Mang barbarians like they're riding girls." On the battlefield, Su Fengnian raised the arrow and looked forward. Further away, Dong Zhuan narrowed his eyes, his face dark. It was normal for people to die, especially with Su Fengnian personally taking action. As the king of the southern courtyard, he didn't feel any pain when a few Jianghu experts died. However, if the death was less valuable than expected, if it was in the imperial court and not on the battlefield, then Fatty Dong would definitely jump up and curse. The young wife beside him, who liked to compete with the noble wife, frowned and said softly, "It's not that sending them in batches to be killed by Su is ineffective, but they might not be able to last until Tuoba Bodhisattva arrives. It's best if husband withdraws to the rear and let those level 1 experts, especially those at the finger-profound realm, attack together. They only need to harass from the side and not engage in close combat." They can cut flesh with blunt knives and slowly wear them down. Dong Zhuo shook his head slightly and said with a sinister smile, "They won't come to the table if we don't give them a few appetizers first. Besides, it's fine if Su Fengnian doesn't want to come to the table. Since he killed one of my experts today, I'll let Huda's city move away 100 more corpses today. Let's see whose patience and temper are better. I, Master Dong, have a big family and a big business. I can afford to fight." Dong Zhuo suddenly turned his head and said sternly, "Pass down the order. Let Shui Hong lead another 15,000 soldiers to form a formation and advance. At the same time, tell the 3 generals on the front lines that in today's attack, they are only allowed to retreat after every 1,000 casualties. Send out Sabersmen to supervise the battle. Anyone who dares to retreat without permission will be killed. After the battle, punish their families and tribes." Soon, the Dong family army's crow pen went to convey the military order. Dong Zhuo tapped his teeth and said softly, "If they have the ability, let me order them to retreat only after every 1,000 casualties." Her scalp went numb. She asked in a trembling voice, "Husband, isn't this too extreme?" Dong Zhuo snorted and said in a deep voice, "As long as we cross the threshold of Huda city, then the main army under my command will be able to challenge Beiliang's 300,000 border soldiers. If they went one step further, as long as they crossed Beiliang and smashed the Su family's iron cavalry, there would be no other army in the world that could compete with his Dong family army. If one more person died here today, then maybe 10 fewer people would die in the central plains of Liang. This account was worth it." Chapter 1507. Su Fengnian's existence was like a reef in a river. Although it stirred up huge waves, it couldn't stop the surging torrent. On the battlefield north of Huda city, the cavalry on both sides of the infantry phalanx had already suppressed the enemy with several rounds of projectile shots. The shield-wielding infantrymen at the head of the tide raised their shields outside the city. The archers at the back braved the rain of arrows from the city and launched the first wave of projectile shots. While the shield-wielding infantrymen and archers were attacking and defending, the scaling ladders and towers suddenly sped up in the gaps between the phalanx. While the latter attracted the attention of the Beiliang's crossbows, the archers under the cover of the shield-wielding infantrymen didn't stop shooting. More Beimang soldiers, who acted as men of sacrifice, began to run wildly. They didn't wear heavy iron armor, only lighter leather armor. They held a shield in one hand and a saber in the other. These men of sacrifice, who had been conserving their energy during the advance of the phalanx, began to charge forward when they were 150 steps away from the city. They would play the most bloody role in the history of war. Almost at the same time, nearly 100 scaling ladders raised high by the Beimang soldiers were placed in the gaps between the battlements. As the name suggested, the 10 or so towers, which were almost as tall as the city, formed a pattern of confrontation with the city after they stopped. At this time, they seemed to show their ferocious faces. The thick cowhide, which was called a mask by the remnants of the southern dynasties of Beimang, was suddenly torn off. The archers hiding in the towers were all great archers of the grassland. Compared to the archers who created the rain of arrows behind the shield-wielding infantrymen, their accuracy was far better. They wanted to kill as many soldiers of Huda's city who could hide in their blind spots as possible. Between the towers, the scaling ladders with iron hooks at the top were like maggots in tarsal bones, biting the body of the giant of the northwest border, Huda's city. At the same time, the ordinary soldiers who pushed the scaling ladders first began to climb the ladders with their shields. The shields in their hands were smaller than those of the shield-wielding infantrymen, but they were sturdier than the men of sacrifice who had followed them to the city. These soldiers' duty was to open a path for the men of sacrifice behind them. They didn't expect them to be able to reach the top of the city, so they simply didn't hold any weapons. They were purely using their flesh and blood and even their lives in exchange for that little bit of height. In the distance, a group of elite cavalry appeared beside Dong Zhuo. Their iron armor was particularly bright, but it wasn't flashy. Each of them had a big bow, a light crossbow, and a saber. There was an iron spear hanging on the side of the saddle. They were the elite guards of the Beimang royal court, Yelu and Murong. They were the iron guards of Chia Shui, the iron guards of Shui, the elite guards of Bimortal's royal families. The only heavy cavalry of Beimang that had never appeared in the world was selected from the Xie Shui guards. From this, it could be seen that Beimang relied heavily on this army. 200 Xie Shui guards surrounded a young man and woman. The man was wearing a light yellow boa suit. He was born with a rough appearance, but he seemed to be ill. His face was pale, and he sat on the back of a Fergana horse. He was slightly bent and seemed to be restrained. On the other hand, the graceful and generous woman beside him seemed to be more adapted to the atmosphere of the battlefield than her man. She squinted her eyes and looked in the direction of the city wall. Occasionally, she would retract her gaze and look at the figure that was constantly breaking the formation and getting closer and closer. She exuded a deep and gloomy aura. In her chess and sword music school, except for Taiping Ling, who was still the emperor's tutor, and Hong Jingyan, who was fighting at the mouth of the gourd, there were a few other famous poets. The ancestor of bronze men was missing, the great music school had died in battle, and Huang Qing, who was close to the sword Qi, had also died. Therefore, as the famous poet of the chess and sword music school, Han Gu, she, who had always been regarded as the graceful crown princess of Beimang, had almost forced her man to come here. She wanted to see with her own eyes the culprit that could cause the collapse of half of her sect. The crown prince of Beimang, Yelu Hongkai, whispered, "King of the South Courtyard, that guy is still breaking the formation and coming here. Should we retreat a little later?" Dong Zhuo chuckled and didn't say anything. Fatty Dong's wife, the fifth fox, frowned. In the past, she had heard from the woman who always competed with her for the title of first wife that Yelu Hongkai seemed to have been scared out of his wits when he was young. Now, he looked 70 to 80% similar to the late emperor, but his boldness was lacking. He even fainted at the sight of blood. Every time he went on a hunting trip with the empress, he could only rely on the prey that his personal guard, Xie Shui, caught to get by. The fifth fox quickly felt relieved. If Yelu Hongkai was as talented and astute as his father, he would have died a long time ago, just like many other Yelu descendants. Yelu Hongkai probably realized that his proposal was somewhat inappropriate, so he quickly found a way out for himself. He pretended to be calm and said, "King of the South Courtyard, aren't we waiting for the military god? The deeper the king of Beimang breaks through the formation, the more energy he will need. If our position is too close to the front, won't that Su guy immediately run into a wall and retreat? When the time comes, the one surnamed Su will suffer and hide in Tiger Head City without coming out. Wouldn't that ruin the South Courtyard King's plan?" Dong Zhuo finally turned his head slowly and looked at the burly man with the most distinguished status in Beimang. He smiled and said, "Your Highness is right. Luring the enemy deep into the enemy's territory with a deep understanding of the art of war is also good. Let's do as Your Highness says. How about we retreat 500 steps?" Yelu Hongkai whispered, "Will 800 steps be safer?" Dong Zhuo laughed and said, "Whatever Your Highness says." Dong family's personal army and the crown prince's cowardly Shui iron guards began to withdraw. Those hidden experts and arqueballista formations also began to move. Yelu Hongkai immediately smiled widely, even his waist subconsciously straightening a bit. It was unknown if this crown prince who was like a puppet in Beimang's imperial court was rejoicing that he escaped danger, or if he was enjoying the great sense of accomplishment brought by Fatty Dong's respect. Yelu Hongkai reined in his horse and turned around. When he was about to raise his whip in high spirits, he suddenly heard Dong Zhuo cough a few times from beside him. The crown prince stared at this king of the South Courtyard in confusion, his face full of confusion. Fatty Dong secretly moved his chin. Only now did Yelu Hongkai notice that his wife was still standing in place, having no intention of retreating with him at all. This Beimang crown prince who didn't have any news of accomplishments in Liang's royal court released a light sigh, indicating for the cowardly Shui iron guards to continue forward. He turned his horse around alone and arrived at her side, gently asking, "What's wrong?" She raised her horsewhip, pointing it in Tiger Head City's direction, coldly saying, "On that battlefield, my tens of thousands of great Mang men are all heading to their deaths." Yelu Hongkai reached out his hand to rub his chin, nodding and saying, "Indeed, Bailiang indeed dares to fight, but when have my grasslands warriors ever feared death?" She slowly turned around, looking at this man who had slept on the same bed as her for many years, her eyes full of anger and sorrow for his misfortune. At the same time, her limpid eyes seemed to be asking this man who was the future lord of the grassland's men didn't fear death, to the extent where even the king of Biyao dared to personally charge into battle. Then what about you, Yelu Hongkai? Yelu Hongkai didn't seem to dare look the crown prince's wife in the eye, lowering his head and saying, "Let's go." She lowered her horsewhip, saying with a sneer, "How can retreating 800 steps be enough? It's better if we directly return to Shijing." After turning around, she took the lead to head north, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Yelu Hongkai looked at her rear figure, his lips moving slightly, but in the end, he still didn't release any sound. Behind this couple, further south of that lone figure, a great battle was raging in Wuxia City. Wuxia City's unparalleled and sturdy defense line was a line that separated the living and the dead. On the northern defense line, the city wall was 15 feet tall. The top part of the wall was filled with mortar mixed with tung oil, glutinous rice, and lime. Just this part alone could be more than 10 feet tall, and 7 layers of bricks were added to it. On the city wall, other than the main arrow tower above the main gate, there were 12 piers, 8 large crossbows, and 2 turrets built on the east and west sections. The Biyao frontier army had battlements and parapets on both sides of the city wall, which was known as the horse path. There were more than 2,000 arrow stacks in Wuxia City that could be used for archery and observation. Every brick in this city located in the extreme northwest of the Liang dynasty had a seal on it, clearly indicating the era, the kiln, and the name of the craftsman to prevent the craftsman from dereliction of duty. In the northern direction of Wuxia City, there were 3 gates, the main gate, the arrow tower, and the gatehouse. Lu Jinu, the commanding general of Wuxia City, stood on the top of the tallest arrow tower, overlooking the entire city from above. This was because Hong Jia, who had brought many scholars and craftsmen to Beimang, had rushed north. In the history of warfare, there had never been a time when a nomadic tribe had attacked a city in such a high level, overshadowing many local dynasties in the Central Plains in history. More importantly, Beimang had never been so determined to abandon their horses, and they were still so fearless even after dismounting to fight. Wuxia City claimed to have the richest and most complete stockpile in the Liang dynasty, and it was also Beiyang's largest stockpile of weapons. However, in less than 2 months of defense, more than 4,000 crossbows had been damaged. Half of the crossbow platforms had been destroyed, and more than 20 winches used to store battle equipment had been destroyed. As a result, Wuxia City had to replace the greatly reduced power of the brick and clay battle equipment. More than half of Northern Mang's 1,000 or so death-sworn soldiers who made it up the city walls were either injured or killed. Even though there were more than 10 death-sworn soldiers who made it up the city walls, in the end, they still couldn't gain a firm footing. Below the city walls, there were layers upon layers of corpses and wounded soldiers who couldn't be dragged out of the battlefield in time. The former were silent, while the latter howled in grief. Their casualties, apart from the arrows that poured down from above, could also be caused by a country's pot of boiling oil, rolling batons, or even batons similar to those used by Navy ships. A single strike from these batons could instantly shatter an entire cloud ladder. Meanwhile, the Northern Mang strong soldiers who climbed up the cloud ladders were as weak as mosquitoes, killed on the city walls with a single strike. Chapter 1508. Compared with the bravery of the men of sacrifice on the ladder, the Beimang archers in the giant towers outside the city caused significant damage to the defenders of Tiger Head City. Compared with the Beimang soldiers who had to pay the price of less heavy armor in order to climb up the city quickly, the Biyao frontier army's armors were tougher and sturdier. Earlier, the archers of the Beimang's 2 flanks and the archers behind the shield soldiers seemed to be dense, but they could not cause any real damage unless they hit the vital parts. However, the Beimang's arrows could almost be called a face-to-face, close-range shooting, especially when they were all excellent archers. One by one, the defenders of Tiger Head City had their throats and eyes pierced through. Many Biyao soldiers even had their armors pierced through on the spot. The ladders in the infantry phalanx were constantly placed on top of the city wall. After more than 1,000 light-armored men of sacrifice opened a path for the rear to buy time, Beimang would not give Tiger Head City any chance to breathe. Soon, the strong men of Beimang wearing iron helmets and chain armor began to climb up the tower. If the first batch of men of sacrifice were all agile Beimang infantry, then this batch of strong men of sacrifice could be said to be comparable to the heavy infantry of the Central Plains who had almost destroyed the cavalry in history if they put on real heavy armor. When these strong men climbed up the city wall, even if the arrows shot down from the top of the city wall were close at hand, they only paused for a moment with their shields raised. Occasionally, a powerful Biyao archer would shoot an arrow through the shield and the sharp arrowhead directly into the arm, but they would never flinch. In the deafening sound of fighting, a Beimang man climbing up the tower had 4 or 5 arrows nailed into the shield on top of his head. He was in the prime of his life, a man from a small tribe on the northern grassland. For him, there was no royal court or Aquarius state. This time, he followed the army to the south only because he wanted to accumulate enough military merits before winter this year so that his son, who was growing up, could have enough meat to eat and be promoted by one level with him. He hoped that his son could walk out of the unpredictable grassland in the future and have a chance to go to the central plains of Liang on his behalf. As for himself, he did not expect to leave the battlefield alive. This tiger-head city was too hard to shake, which was very different from the rumors when he joined the army. However, he was not annoyed because he was deceived. Even if he died in the battle, the pension would be enough for his son to grow up and let his son grow into a grassland man who was not inferior to him. Out of the corner of his eye, the strong man wearing iron armor and a shield on top of his head saw that a tower opposite the city wall was heavily smashed down by a baton. The tower shook violently and the top of the tower was smashed into pieces. More than a dozen master archers were killed on the spot and merged into the tower like meat paste. He breathed heavily, gritted his teeth, and continued to climb up. Then, he left the ladder in an instant. Not only him, but 3 or 4 strong men behind him also met the same fate. His heart immediately turned to ashes. Immediately afterwards, he and several other Beimang strong men's backs smashed into the city wall near the ladder at almost the same time. They were like a bunch of pitiful grasshoppers that were strung up by ropes. The man who fell until he was completely dizzy held his shield tightly, raising his arm to block above his head. Sure enough, immediately afterwards, there were light crossbows that shot down from above the city wall. He who temporarily escaped this disaster knew that the true danger was still to come. Their group had their armors hooked by Beiyang's flying owls. This type of weapon used specifically to deal with Great Mang's strong men was a 7-zhang long iron chain. There were sharp flying hooks nailed to the iron chain every 3 feet. Once the latter armored soldiers were hooked, they wouldn't be able to control themselves, quickly being dragged up. What welcomed them were spears one after another. He had personally seen many strong men die miserably under these flying owls. If he hurriedly removed his armor at this time, trying to escape by jumping off the city wall, it wouldn't be realistic at all. He who was suspended at the very top of the iron chain lowered his head, roaring angrily, "Hold the warblade tightly." This iron chain flying owl was pulled back by several Beiyang soldiers. The 4 Beimang strong men's iron armor grinded against the walls, releasing chi-chi noises. Out of the 4 of them, he was the first to climb up to the top of the city wall. His mind was blank. He instinctively turned around and faced the top of the city wall. After he was pulled out of the city wall, he held his shield in front of him. Instantly, his shield was hit by a spear and smashed into his chest. However, when he tried to swing his saber randomly, a northern Liang guard on the city wall wielding a strange straight saber smashed into his head. Blood splattered everywhere, and he died on the spot. As for the 3 strong men who were dragged onto the city wall after his death, they either died under this type of axe or spear. Their corpses were removed from the flying owl and then casually pushed off the city wall. Then, that flying owl was flung off the city wall again. On Tiger Head City's battlefront, one side was like ants, the other side was like ants, both sides' lives truly were like ants. Su Fengnian, who was deep in enemy territory, continued forward, unstoppable like a hot knife through butter. He swept through everything before him, no one able to withstand a single blow. However, Su Fengnian could clearly feel a few balls of dense energy following him. These people were undoubtedly Beimang martial path experts who were waiting for a chance to strike. Most of them were at Master Realm. Further away, 200 steps away, there were two top experts, one King Kong and one Xian Ji. Su Fengnian continued forward in a straight line, killing people without any fancy movements. He mostly used the burst and arc spear techniques of the four-word formula that Spear Immortal King had comprehended. Especially the arc spear technique, it was wide open and was best suited for chaotic battles. Wherever the arc spear technique was used, the burst word formula energy would be mixed in. Within 20 feet of Su Fengnian, no one survived. However, Su Fengnian didn't feel proud at all. Instead, his heart became heavier and heavier. He headed straight for Dong Zhuo's flag. Everyone knew that the only people who could stop him were those martial path experts. Normal soldiers were useless. However, the Beimang infantry formations pushed forward without any hesitation. If they were unlucky enough to meet him, they would die. Chapter 1509. In history, the grassland cavalry's large-scale invasions to the south mostly bypassed the strategic passes and majestic cities and towns, or they surrounded the enemy without attacking, forcing the enemy to disarm and surrender. In the true sense of the word, the nomads on horseback were not good at siege battles, and the losses outweighed the gains. Instead of fighting to the death with the defending army at the border, it was better to go around the city and raid the hinterland where the city walls were low and the morale was low. Even though Su Fengnian had long understood that Northern Mang's plan was a bad one, that they had no choice but to make an example out of Northern Liang, Dong Zhuo, and the Magistrate of Peace were clearly ambitious as well. They wanted to use Northern Liang's 300,000 border soldiers as whetstones. This was the same reasoning as when Su Fengnian used Tuoba Bodhisattva to build up momentum. If they could win, they would be able to gallop across a wide expanse of flat plains. Once Beiliang fell, Beimang, which seemed to have suffered heavy casualties, could win the most precious general situation. It was just like when the Su family's cavalry defeated West Shu and secured the victory at the Battle of West Leibi. After that, they attacked West Shu and South Tang. It was just the icing on the cake. The key point that made Su Fengnian feel heavy was that Beimang only had Dong Zhuo and Taiping Ling at the beginning. However, after the fierce battles at Huda Town and Huluku, Beimang's soldiers began to quickly get rid of the discomfort of dismounting and fighting. Su Fengnian led the Phantom Cavalry to fight Beimang's cavalry outside Huluku. At that time, he did not see Zhong Tan leading his troops to attack the city, so he did not have a deep impression of it. Only when he was there and saw them advancing in an orderly manner and taking turns attacking the city did he realize that Beimang's million soldiers had a high chance of winning. Su Fengnian was suddenly enraged. Beiliang was a small place with few people. Every time Qingliang Mountain recruited a master, they had to use them carefully. Even Su Fengnian treated the Finger Xian Realm Sword Path Grandmaster Mi Fengjie with respect. But on this battlefield, a few Master Realm Masters had already died. Out of the 3 that showed up, there were 2 that blocked his path. He found some clues and casually tossed out an arrow to kill one of them. In the blink of an eye, there were 6. On the other hand, how many Master Realm Masters could there be in the entire Whispering Water Room? Just as Su Fengnian was about to kill the hidden masters, those Wu Dao masters suddenly retreated from the battlefield at the same time. Su Fengnian raised his head and looked. It turned out that Dong Zhuo's South Courtyard King flag had begun to move to the rear, luring the enemy in. Su Fengnian, who originally wanted to quickly charge forward, suddenly stopped. For the sake of preventing any accidents from happening on the battlefield, the Huayang Pass Protectorate's Luya and Fu Ling garrisons had made corresponding arrangements. If Northern Mang didn't hesitate to send several thousand cavalry to surround and kill him, the 2 garrisons had even prepared for the worst. Even Lu Jinu had clearly stated that the cavalry within the city could charge out at any time. Su Fengnian had his eyes on Huda City, so he was confident that he could charge in alone and leave the battlefield. However, at this moment, Su Fengnian suddenly had a bad feeling. Dong Zhuo's breakthrough point, or Beimang's breakthrough point, wasn't Huda City or Gourd Mouth, but Beimang's Lu province that both sides had their eyes on at the start but had tacitly given up on as the situation changed. At that time, he had suggested Chu Lushan and Yuan Zuozong to launch an astonishing strategy. They wanted to use the Great Snow Dragon cavalry that had been biding their time and a genuine heavy cavalry as the main force to move their forces and swallow up Yang Yuanzhan's army. They would first invite the enemy into the jar and then catch the turtle in the jar. In that case, was it possible for Northern Mang to change their strategy before this and attempt to swallow up Lu province in one go? Before Su Fengnian arrived at Huaiyang Pass, he had already followed the plan and asked Chu Lushan to give Ko Jianghuai the title of Lu Province General. He would lead 3,000 cavalry and 6,000 Liangzhou infantry to assist Lu Province and work with the Longxiang army to guard the Lu Province battlefield where Tuoba Bodhisattva had joined the battle. Su Fengnian stood where he was and looked towards the west, towards the distant Lu Province. At this time, more than 20 cavalry had unknowingly followed the king of Beimang into the battlefield, each of them carrying a sword. The two at the front were the sword crown Wu Luding of the Wu family sword tomb and the female sword attendant Suihua. Wu Luding rode up to Su Fengnian's side. This young swordsman said with a mischievous smile, "You don't dare to advance anymore?" Su Fengnian didn't say anything. The sword attendant Suihua, who was used to closing her eyes to rest, frowned and said in a low voice, "Let's get down to business." Wu Luding immediately kept quiet out of fear and helplessly said, "Protector General Chu wanted me to pass on a message. He said that he felt that the boy Dongjua has bad intentions, so he took the initiative last night to bring several hundred of his personal guards to Lu Province. However, at the border between Lianglu Province and Lu Province, he already had 8,000 soldiers lying in ambush there, waiting for Beimang to make this move. Oh, and Protector General Chu also said that those 8,000 soldiers were all troublemakers that had been urgently picked out from the various border armies. Without him personally leading the troops, those old soldiers wouldn't be able to do anything." Su Fengnian suddenly began to laugh heartily, unable to stop no matter what. Wu Luding turned his head to Suihua and asked, "Have you gone crazy?" Su Fengnian finally stopped laughing and looked towards Dongzhua's banner in the distance to the north. He smiled and asked, "Do you dare follow me to break the formation for another 2 li?" Wu Luding said without hesitation, "I'm just here to pass on the message." "I don't dare." The female sword attendant opened her eyes and calmly said to Su Fengnian, "Your Highness, please be at ease with your back." Su Fengnian nodded. Those 8,000 old soldiers that had been put together at the last moment. In reality, long before the Su family had died, they had already been disorganized. Even before that, when a certain fatty led his army into Shu, there was no such thing as a direct line of soldiers. It had always been Great General Su Shao who gave him as many soldiers as he wanted to fight. The soldiers under his command were either the ones who died the quickest in the Su family army or the ones who rose the quickest. If one had to give him a name, there was one. It was a battle that had made him famous when he was young. It had taken place by a river. At the time, of the 8,000 cavalry that he had put together, only 400 had survived. After Su Fengnian's hereditary title as the king of Northern Liang, he had a casual conversation with Fatty, who was the governor of Northern Liang, at Huaiyang Pass. Only then did he know that ever since Fatty had led troops in more than 70 battles, there were about 10,000 people left in Northern Liang who had served under him and had not died. The older ones had already become the family heads of the general families. Most of them were young men in their 40s in the army. The most useless of them should be at least a standard commander at the very least. If Su Fengnian remembered correctly, that river was called the Yeluo. At the border bordering the cold stream. A fatty who had just put on his armor and mounted a horse looked at the cavalry in front of him, those familiar faces. He laughed and asked, "Everyone, how does it feel to go from a general to a lowly soldier under my, Chu Lushan's, command?" The cavalry roared with laughter. The fatty beamed and said, "I hear that there are quite a few people from the infantry who came here to make up the numbers. I, Chu Lushan, am a sentimental person and will not bicker with you all. Presumably, after all these years, you haven't fallen too far behind in archery and horses." The cavalry laughed even louder. The fatty's face suddenly seethed with killing intent as he viciously said, "Everyone here knows an old rule. If you follow me into battle and don't die, you'll be promoted. This time, I'll have to disappoint all of you. It's hard to say if you'll die, but even if you don't die, you won't be promoted. Let me say this first, the enemy this time is the cavalry under the direct command of that Dong Zhuo of Beimang. There are at least 20,000 of them. We only have 8,000 people. What do we do? A solemn silence reigned. Chu Lushan suddenly clasped his fist and said, "Then I invite everyone to make another trip to the Yeluo with Chu Lushan." Chapter 15:10. In the northern part of West Shu, there were 9 mountains that looked like swords. Among them, where the big and small swords faced each other, the old emperor of West Shu chiseled a rock to open the door. People called it the Sword Gate. This was because after Liang unified the Central Plains, the Swords Gate mountain road had been banished into the Cold Palace. For many years, only those small merchants would travel through this road. As for the Sword Gate, after Jian Zhouhuang's death battle with Wang Xianji in Martial Emperor City, some people said that the reason for its nickname was due to the fact that Jian Zhouhuang had comprehended the art of swordsmanship while observing the mountains. There were even some who said that before Jian Zhouhuang left Shu, he had carved a sword manual on a stone wall somewhere along the plank road. Now, there were quite a few young swordsmen from western Shu who came to the plank road in search of opportunities. It was the beginning of summer, when the peach blossoms gradually fell. The winding path between the mountain walls was slightly dark and damp. A middle-aged man was riding a donkey, and a handsome young man who looked like a page boy was leading the donkey. The young man was carrying a large bamboo box, and he was muttering to himself. The ordinary-looking man was probably used to the young man's complaints, so he turned a deaf ear to him and dozed off leisurely on the donkey. At this moment, a group of people came from the front. The leader was a common woodcutter in West Shu. He was leading a group of young men and women in embroidered clothes. The young man's eyes brightened. He threw a bunch of peach branches to the middle-aged man and whispered, "Master, master, hurry up. Turn around and ride the donkey. Also, it's time for you to recite a poem. Otherwise, with so many donkey-riding followers in the world, you won't be able to show your identity. Otherwise, you can't call yourself the Peach Blossom Sword God. No one will believe you." The middle-aged man said helplessly, "I've met more than 10 groups of people along the way. Every time, I have to recite a poem with the word peach blossom. How can I have so many poems in my stomach?" The young man glared and threatened, "Then I'll repeat the previous one. That, immortals in the forest, it sounds quite celestial. Master, if you don't recite it, I won't help you lead the donkey." The middle-aged man was indeed good-tempered and easy to talk to. He lazily turned around and rode the donkey. He held the peach branch in his hand and recited loudly, "Looking at the peach blossoms in the forest, the dusk deepens and the road grows longer. The old man taught me the 3 Pure Ones book, lived for 1,000 years and laughed at the sovereign king." The young man, who had been as tired as a dog, instantly assumed the demeanor of a child under an immortal. He looked straight ahead and led the donkey forward in large strides. When the group of young masters and young ladies who hired the woodcutter to lead the way saw this scene, they were stunned at first. Then, one of them turned to his companion and said, "Hey, these 2 little swindlers are bullying us because we haven't seen the world. Do they really think that they are dong-tied just because they got a donkey and a peach branch? I'll get a white horse and wear a saber, then I'll be a Su Fengnian." The young man was so angry that his face turned red. The middle-aged man laughed and turned around again, no longer riding the donkey backwards. He threw the peach branch into the gap of the bamboo box. The 2 groups of people brushed past each other lightly. The young man with the donkey had carefully arranged this chance encounter, but in the end, he only received countless disdainful looks. The man looked at the dispirited youth's back and chuckled. "Angry? Don't be angry. Actually, Master has been wanting to tell you this for a long time. In Jianghu, it's all about a real person not revealing his true self." The young man snorted coldly. Obviously, he was still angry. The middle-aged man comforted him. "All right, Master will definitely bring you to see the great scenery of Shu this time." The young man was silent. The man could only smile. "Why don't Master ride the sword and let those people broaden their horizons?" The young man sighed. "Forget it. Those guys have eyes but can't see. Anyway, they are the ones who are at a disadvantage. The young man had his own worries. Master, it's not that I want to criticize you. Among the 4 grandmasters in Jianghu, Chao Chongqing admires you. Later, you fought with Tuoba Bodhisattva so fiercely that even Su Fengnian's flying sword was given by you. But now, everyone is talking about how Chao Chongqing defeated that useless monk and how domineering Su Fengnian was when he fought with Tuoba Bodhisattva for thousands of miles in the western region. No one said anything good about you. I'm worried. The man joked. Then why do you always practice swordsmanship when I teach you swordsmanship? The young man sighed heavily like an old man. I know my own limitations. I don't have the foundation nor the talent. I can't be a disciple, so I can only hope that Master will be more successful. The man laughed angrily. You're really open-minded. The young man suddenly turned his head and asked, Master, why did you take me in as your disciple back then? Look at Wang Xianji, Lin Ya, and the others. They are all top-notch martial arts grandmasters. So let me tell you, don't expect me to help you make a name for yourself in Jianghu. The man said casually, Master, what do I need that for? Besides, it's great to live happily and die without regrets. Do you think that Chao Chongqing, Su Fengnian, and Tuoba Bodhisattva can do this? They can't do it. If Master were to die tomorrow, you would be able to rely on yourself and not have to worry about food and clothing. So I don't have too many people and things to worry about. Su Fengnian can't let go of his father's inheritance, Chao Chongqing can't let go of Dechu's empire, and Tuoba Bodhisattva can't let go of fame and fortune. Don't be envious of these land immortals who don't live happily. The young man sighed. It's really tiring. It was the real peach blossom sword deity, Dong Tai. He smiled and said, Do you feel less tired now that I've said that? The young man chuckled. It didn't seem like he was trying to find joy in his misery. He said sincerely, Master, you're right. There was a commotion behind the master and disciple. The young man turned his head to look. It was the young masters and young ladies who had turned back and stopped not far away. Then, they sent the woodcutter to run in front of them. He seemed a little embarrassed. He rubbed his hands and smiled at Deng Taya, who was on the donkey's back. Can we discuss something? Dong Tai smiled and said, Brother, what is it? The woodcutter lowered his voice and said, Brother, I'm sorry. Those rich kids said that they want to buy a donkey from you. I can't afford to offend them, so I have no choice but to run this errand. Brother, if you're willing to sell it, I think you can raise the price and ask for 20 or 30 taels. I think they won't care about the difference. Before Dong Tai could say anything, the young man was already furious. He didn't vent his anger on the woodcutter. Instead, he turned to the group of rich kids and shouted, Our donkey is not for sale. We won't sell it even if they give us 10,000 taels. Dong Tai, who had turned the donkey around, touched his chin and said softly, If it's gold, we'll sell it. The young man, who wanted to see the world in chaos, added, Count yourselves lucky. Master said that we'll sell it for 10,000 taels of gold. The woodcutter shook his head. These two people really didn't know the dangers of the world. They were in the wilderness. If that group of angry young people had bad intentions, would he have to report them to the authorities after he went down the mountain? Along the way, this group of men and women were all very arrogant. They kept talking about the governor of a certain county and a certain general. They didn't seem to be from an ordinary family. Just as the woodcutter was begging for peace, the 7 or 8 people had already walked over aggressively. One of them was a young man with a strong body and a sword hanging from his waist. He pointed at Dong Tai and sneered, Old man, don't be so shameless. This young master is magnanimous. I'll give you one last chance. This donkey, I'll buy it for 50 taels of silver. It's not that I can't pay a higher price. This young master once spent 4,000 taels of gold in a month. However, I've always had a principle in life. Even if I'm a sucker, I still have a bottom line. The young man suppressed the anger in his chest and said, Master, how can you tolerate this? In short, I don't want to tolerate this anymore. I want to make a move. I won't be able to deal with a grandmaster, but I'm more than enough to deal with these guys. Dong Tai glanced at a beautiful young woman in the group and then looked at his disciple. The latter swallowed his saliva guiltily. Chapter 15:11. At that time, Dong Tai had just left the Wu family's sword tomb and was not yet the peach blossom sword god. He was a nobody in Jianghu and had no interest in showing off his swordsmanship to others. He tolerated as much as he could. In the early years, it was this foolish disciple who had been beaten up by others when he saw injustice on the road. Perhaps this was his innate chivalrous heart. It was something that Dong Tai did not have. To Dong Tai, everything in the world, except for the sword in his heart, had nothing to do with him. Later, one day, after listening to a storyteller's Jianghu romance in a restaurant and commenting on the sects and masters in Jianghu, his disciple suddenly said that he wanted to learn martial arts. Dong Tai laughed and asked him what would happen if he learned martial arts. He said that he had not thought about it and would think about other things after he learned it. At that time, Dong Tai was happy to get rid of this burden, so he secretly helped him enter a small sect. When the child, who was thought to have a good foundation, became a direct disciple of the small sect, it did not take long for him to lose his drive to become a master. Practicing martial arts was normal, but because he was a direct disciple, he could get 1 tael of silver every month, so he became a little money grubber. Dong Tai, who was worried about him, had no choice but to show up. The excited child saw Dong Tai at the gate and said that he wanted to treat him to a good meal. Then he ran back to the sect and took the bag of silver he had saved up. It turned out that the child had bought a saber for Dong Tai and the sect. Because the child had traveled with Dong Tai in the past, he had occasionally heard Dong Tai snort disdainfully at the swordsman of the world. He thought that his savior, who could not afford a weapon, should not like being a swordsman but rather a saber wielder. From then on, Dong Tai took in his one and only disciple. As for the saber, he exchanged it for a donkey. When Dong Tai went to Martial Emperor City of the Eastern Sea to fight with Wang Xianji, it was a time when peach blossoms were blooming. His disciple was very attentive, at least much more attentive than Dong Tai, who had gone empty-handed. He earnestly advised his master not to fight with someone empty-handed, as it would be too disadvantageous. In the end, he could not persuade his master who was unwilling to use a sword. The child could only point angrily at a peach tree, saying that his master should at least use a peach branch as a sword. After that, there was a peach blossom sword deity who rode a donkey in the Jianghu. Ever since Dong Tai became famous, this disciple would still complain about his master not being able to win against Wang Xianji. He complained that Wang Xianji had an advantage in age, and that it was an unfair victory. He complained that Dong Tai gave that box of 12 flying swords to Su Fengnian, but he did not complain about his master not thinking about his disciple first when he had something good. Instead, he complained that his master never showed that box of flying swords in front of him, and treated him as an outsider. Because of this, he even had a cold war with Dong Tai for half a month. The youth also complained that the Jianghu did not have good eyesight. His master was clearly a grandmaster in the art of killing, but he had to stand shoulder to shoulder with the other 3. Amidst these trivial complaints, Dong Tai felt that his ears were about to grow calluses. Then, suddenly, one day, he realized that this seemingly young disciple of his had really grown up. He began to steal glances at the beautiful women he met on the streets. It turned out that his lips were starting to grow stubble. Just as Dong Tai was in a daze, the tall and sturdy youth holding the sword angrily said, "My temper." "Hey, old man, don't be so shameless. Luckily, I'm not an unscrupulous disciple who uses his power to bully others. Otherwise, you would have already been beaten to the ground. Hurry up, 50 taels of silver, and the donkey is mine. You and that brat can take the money and scram. It's enough for you 2 poor bastards to go to the best restaurant in the Shu lands to eat and drink." Dong Tai flipped off the donkey and patted the back of the donkey. He looked at his disciple who was much less impulsive than when he was young. Back then, he knew that he couldn't win, but he still wanted to get beaten up. Now, he was Dong Tai's disciple. Even if he couldn't exchange blows with a level 1 master, he would have no problem withstanding 20 to 30 blows from a level 2 master. However, he was becoming more and more disinterested in small fights. Dong Tai did not pay attention to the disciple who was actually not too bad. He walked in front of his disciple and rubbed his head. He smiled lazily and said, "Disciple, although you don't have much potential, I am very happy to have a disciple like you." The youth felt his hair stand on end and said, "Master, what's wrong with you? You can't be sick, right?" Dong Tai smiled and said, "I'm just happy." In the crowd, a young man who drank too much waved his fan. He didn't put the donkey-riding middle-aged uncle in his eyes at all. However, that little bastard's eyes were too evil. Just now, he actually dared to secretly look at the girl he liked. Did he think that he didn't notice? The only daughter of the Western Shuizhou Deputy General, was she someone that a donkey-riding young man could covet? He skillfully closed his fan and smiled at the youth. 50 taels of silver is not a small amount. If you want to go to the Jianghu, you can buy a good weapon. If you want to go to the imperial examinations, you can even buy a lot of books. Dong Tai heard these words that were like needles hidden in cotton floss and laughed it off. His disciple rolled his eyes and said to Dong Tai, "Master, let's go." "Ignore them." Dong Tai nodded and said, "Give me the bamboo box." The youth frowned and said, "Don't. Although I'm afraid of being tired, I'm more afraid of our donkey being tired." "Master, you're carrying it." In the end, it's still the donkey carrying it. It's not young anymore. Dong Tai glared at him and said, "Give it to me if I want you to." The youth reluctantly took off the bamboo box and handed it to Dong Tai. He couldn't help but mumble again. Large and small swords faced off against each other. Between the mountains, there was a strong wind. Occasionally, birds would fly past. Dong Tai rarely carried the box himself. He then smiled at his disciple and said, "You go down the mountain first." In the next moment, Dong Tai made a strange movement. He took out the peach branch from the bamboo box and threw it high up. Just when everyone was confused, someone with sharp eyes suddenly realized that after the peach branch was thrown, it actually stopped in the air. Just when the youth was at a loss, Dong Tai lightly pushed his shoulder and shouted, "Raise the sword with chi, mountain stepping technique." After the youth who was pushed out of the cliff by his master heard this, even though he was high up in the air, he still subconsciously made the sword stepping technique. The youth just happened to step on the peach branch. This scene was like an immortal riding a sword. After a brief moment of panic, the young man, who had never eaten pork but had at least seen pigs run, suddenly laughed heartily and shouted, "Let's go down the mountain." The youth rode the wind and went down the mountain. His laughter echoed in the cliffs for a long time. How many Jianghu youths in the world dreamed of roaming Jianghu with a sword? How many people could be like the youth who was leading the donkey, flying around Jianghu like an immortal riding the wind? Dong Tai rode the donkey again and joked with the stunned youths, 50 taels of silver is really not enough to buy this donkey. Finally, Dong Tai glanced at the young lady that his disciple liked and said with a smile, "Little girl, remember that youth." He nagged Wang Xianji about the martial emperor's city, drank wine with Chao Chongqing at the same table, pointed at Guangling Crown Prince Zhao Yuang and cursed. Of course, the most important thing is that this guy gave me the nickname of Peach Blossom Sword God. Isn't he awesome? The young lady was so shocked that she couldn't speak. The old donkey's hooves tapped on the ground leisurely and went further and further away. The Peach Blossom Sword God on the donkey's back suddenly felt regretful. Tuoba Bodhisattva had already fought 3 of the 4 grandmasters. He couldn't fight Chao Chongqing anymore. Then, Dong Tai didn't know if he would have a chance to fight with Su Ke in this lifetime. "Kid, don't die. If you die under the hooves of the Beimang barbarians, won't you feel ashamed?" Martial Emperor City's status in Jianghu plummeted after old weirdo Wang died in Baiyang, especially after Yu Groom and the others left the East Sea one after another. This holy land of Jianghu in the past went through a long period of unrest. There were many independent forces in the city. Especially without the restraint of the prohibition of martial arts, the fights between the experts were so frequent that it was difficult to find a higher place to fight. The fights between the sects were even more numerous. It was said that some busybodies calculated that there were as many as 60 sects that rose and fell within half a year. Of course, many of the so-called sects were just small kittens and puppies. All this chaos only began to stabilize after the young man surnamed Jiang had been fighting for half a year on the city wall. As for the young man's identity, there were many speculations. Some said that Jiang Fuding was Wang Xianji's real disciple in closed-door training. Some said that he was a banished immortal like Qi Xianzhu who had great luck and was the ultimate counter to the king of Biyao in this generation. Jiang Fuding, who was a loner in martial emperor's city, didn't pay attention to the affairs of the world. He just fought for the city wall day after day. The handsome young man who used to challenge the king of Biyao with a pawn entering cold on his waist had become as tanned as a fisherman's. Ever since Linya, the grandmaster of fist techniques, left martial emperor's city, Jiang Fuding stopped drinking. In fact, it wasn't like a turtledove occupying a magpie's nest. Wang Xianji's residence had become ownerless. Jiang Fuding used his fists to monopolize old weirdo Wang's former residence. Those who didn't accept it or didn't have eyes had their bodies smashed by him. That night, the bright moon shone over the sea. Chapter 15:12. Using the moonlight, Jiang Fuding sat cross-legged at the top of the city wall with a pot of wine, drinking slowly. This young man with a hidden identity had once been young and arrogant. In such a large great peace city, among his peers, he despised the two sons of General Gu Jiantang for being too rigid. He despised the fourth imperial son for his reputation but lack of ambition. He despised the first imperial son Zhao Wu for being vulgar. He despised the children of the officials for being useless. In the end, he only got along well with the illegitimate son of the previous emperor, Zhao Kai. Before Zhao Kai returned to the capital from Shangyin Academy, and before he died at the Iron Gate Pass of the western regions, the two got drunk. One said he would do great service for the Zhao Kai of Liyang, the other said with a smile that the country was his and the Jianghu was his. In the future, if he helped Zhao Kai sit on the dragon throne, how about he, Jiang Fuding, be conferred the title of King of Freedom? Jiang Fuding gazed at the bright moonlight on the sea and was in a daze. In terms of status and family background, Zhao Kai was the son of the emperor and the disciple of Yang Taisui. He, Jiang Fuding, was not weak. He was the son of the imperial tutor of Liyang. While he had completely concealed his identity and did not have the surname Yuan with that man in order to deal with the endless assassinations, which of the people at the top of Great Peace City dared to underestimate him? The youngest son of the former Minister of Revenue Wang Xiongui, the current leader of the four young masters of Jing, had a conflict with him in his early years. In the end, he had come to kowtow and admit his wrongs that night. When he, Jiang Fuding, was young, he said he wanted to practice the blade. That man who spoke ambiguously asked for Gu Jiantang's blade manual for him. At the time, Gu Jiantang, who was still the Minister of War at the time, even taught him the Thunder Heart. That man even took out the soldier of crossing the river from the inner treasury. In those decades, no less than 20 martial grandmasters had taught him moves. Among them was Lu Hao of the Great Celestial Phenomenon realm of Great Celestial Phenomenon. Since this was the case, how could he, Jiang Fuding, lose to that Su? Jiang Fuding threw the wine pot into the sea and shouted, "How can I accept this? How can I admit defeat?" Jiang Fuding gasped for breath and took out a book from his bosom, as if he wanted to throw it away like the wine jug. However, he raised his arm and in the end, did not throw it away. This book was his father's real legacy. The man whose real name was not known was once the well-deserved emperor's preceptor of Liyang, the most intelligent strategist of the Liang dynasty. His opponents were Sun Ping, Huang Longsher, Su Shao, Zhao Bing, the Prince of Yanqi, and the Spring of Eternal Hui, led by Zhang Julu. Jiang Fuding muttered, "Father, you have never lost, so how can I compare to you?" Jiang Fuding slowly retracted his hand as he looked at the yellowed book with a stupefied expression. The title of the book was written in meticulous script. It was a very strange name, Night Sailing Ship. Jiang Fuding knew the reason because that man once mentioned that among all the knowledge in the world, night sailing was the most difficult to deal with. At the beginning of the book, there was an absurd story about people from the three sects of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. The four of them were sailing on the sea together with an old boatman. The Confucians said that the study of saving the people was awe-inspiring and righteous. The Taoists said that the method of immortality was incomparably mysterious. The monks said that the profound Buddhism was like a fairy scattering flowers. The more the boatman listened, the more frightened he became. He was so scared that he almost threw away the bamboo wormwood in his hand. Later, the more he listened, the more sleepy he became. In the end, he accidentally threw away the bamboo wormwood, causing the four of them to be unable to return to the shore. This book was personally given to Jianghu by Yuan Benshi when he brought Song Kelly out of the capital to travel north and south of the Great Jiang. He only said that the stories in the book were merely hearsay stories from the countryside. They were like scribbles, hardly worthy of being refined. It was purely the work of an old teacher who was bored to death. Other than flipping a few pages for his son to read, there was no other use for it. There were more than 200,000 words in this book, so every page was densely packed. Jianghu could totally imagine the scene without any grandeur. A slightly reclusive old man was on duty in the Hanlin Academy under the identity of Yuan Pu. He had a bottle of cheap and good wine, a plate of fragrant peanuts, and a purple brush that was as sharp as a knife. He sat alone and drank. His strokes were very slow, and his strokes were very small. Every time he wrote something he was satisfied with, he would take a sip of the wine. Jianghu carefully put the book back into his arms and lay back. He looked at the bright moon above his head. When I was young, you told me that heaven and earth gave birth to me as a man. If I win, I'll be a hero. If I lose, I'll be a hero. If I die, I'll be a ghost. Jianghu closed his eyes and said bitterly, but when you saw me for the last time, you said that it was enough for me to live well. After a long silence, the most reclusive young man in the martial emperor city fell into a deep sleep. Bathed in the morning light, Jianghu finally opened his eyes and sat up. He said softly, I've made up my mind. The world can forget 100 or 1,000 Jianghu, but they can't forget Yuan Benshi. Jianghu stood up again and murmured with tears in his eyes, Father. I'll settle the score with Zhao Zhuan and Liang for you. I'll help Zhao Zhu sit on the dragon throne. I miss you very much. Su, if you're lucky enough to survive, we'll meet in the imperial court. Right at this moment, a little boy carrying a small bamboo basket ran up the city wall. His clothes might be shabby, but he was rather neat and tidy. When he didn't speak, his clean little face had a solemn expression that other children of the same age didn't have. When the little boy saw that familiar slender figure, he steadied his breathing and recuperated before shouting, Jianghu. It was said that Wang Xianji's disciples, Yu Groom and Linya, loved to go to that little place for breakfast. A 7 or 8-year-old child's horizons were naturally higher. The child had a skinny dog and would walk the dog around the city when he had nothing to do. It was as though he was a general patrolling his territory. After Jianghu arrived at the martial emperor city, there was no one to help him take care of his life. Especially after Linya left the Eastern Sea, she was very particular about everything. Therefore, she would casually settle her breakfast at that bun shop. Every time, she would spend 20 copper coins to buy a small basket of thin and juicy buns. As time passed, she became familiar with the little boy who collected the money. She would occasionally tease this little boy who was very rigid in everything he did and said. Jianghu was also puzzled. How did such an easygoing couple raise such a strange child who was filled with the aura of an old scholar? The child who followed this old man and Linya with the surname Go passed the basket of buns to Jianghu and said seriously, 20 copper coins. Put it down first. If you forget, I will remind you. Jianghu said helplessly, Go don't care. It's only 20 copper coins. I won't forget you. The little boy stared and said, My surname is Go, and my name is Yufang. I took it from the saint scriptures. When one's parents are around, one should not travel far. There must be a method to travel. Jianghu, who had been quiet in the Eastern Sea for a long time, only showed some of the demeanor of the capital city's top-notch clan when he met this interesting child. He smiled and said, "You don't even know who your parents are. Why do you need to have a method? In my opinion, that green-clothed girl who grew up with you, the nickname she gave you is more suitable. Go don't care, it's easier to call you that." The child put on a stern face and said, "Don't say indecent things." Jiang Fuding laughed and said, "What does a little kid know about etiquette?" Back then, the scholar who told me about etiquette was Duke Yensheng of the Zhang family. The child frowned. "I don't know if that teacher is learned or not, but I know that his students did not learn well." Jiang Fuding, who was being teased and lectured by a child, was not angry. He sat on the city wall and opened the slightly cool bamboo basket. He gently picked up a small and exquisite bun with 2 fingers and threw it into his mouth. His mouth was full of fragrance and endless aftertaste. In the past, in Great Peace City, he had eaten so many delicacies that were called the best in the world that he could not remember the taste. Now, it was these small meat buns that were only 2 copper coins each. If he did not eat a basket of them each day, he would not be able to forget them. Jiang Fuding smacked his lips and ate 6 or 7 buns in one go. Then he seemed to remember something of the past. He chuckled and said, "It rained heavily in Great Peace City. Many fish drowned." Go Yufang sighed and said softly, "It's not funny." Jiang Fuding lowered his head and looked at the buns in the basket. He said emotionally, "That's right. People eat dirt once, and dirt eats people once." The child did not say anything. After all, he was so young and should not have such feelings. Jiang Fuding suddenly turned his head and looked at the child standing beside him. He smiled and said, "After 2nd grade master, entering the Vajra realm depends on perseverance. Finger Xian depends on talent and comprehension. If you want to have the phenomenon of heaven and earth, you have to rely on your innate talent. As for becoming a land immortal, it depends on that illusory fate. Go Yufang, do you want to practice martial arts?" The child shook his head without hesitation and said, "No." Jiang Fuding said in shock, "In this martial emperor city, you interact with people of the underworld every day. You don't want to practice martial arts?" The child said softly, "I heard that practicing martial arts is a bottomless pit. No amount of money can fill it. I have no money." Jiang Fuding suddenly looked at the last bun in the basket in a daze. He asked in surprise, "Go Yufang, I remember that I have already eaten 10 buns. Why is there one more today?" The child said calmly, "Grandpa said that you people of the underworld need to train your body. Therefore, you need to eat more. I asked Grandpa for one more. I can only ask for one more. Otherwise, this basket of buns will be a loss. It is not easy for Grandpa to earn money." Jiang Fuding did not know whether to laugh or cry. Then, he smiled gently. He seemed to be reluctant to eat the 11th bun immediately. Chapter 15:13. Jiang Fuding finally picked up the steamed bun and ate it slowly. He looked into the distance and laughed softly, "You might not want what I give you. Moreover, in the long run, I might not be good to you. However, I'll be leaving this city soon and most likely won't be coming back. But I'll miss you, little brat, and I hope you'll live well. I hope that when you grow up one day and I haven't been eaten by 2D, you'll come and find me. I'll treat you to a drink then." Hearing that Jiang Fuding was leaving the martial emperor city, the child was a little disappointed, but he didn't show it on his face. He only nodded and said, "Okay." Jiang Fuding smiled and lifted the bamboo basket with one hand. He looked at the vast sea with rising tides and laughed loudly. "Don't you see the 3 mountains and 5 peaks in the sky? Don't you see the endless sandstorms in the northwest killing people? Don't you see the great rivers flowing into the sea and never returning? Listen to me, one's life is only 100 years. If you want to seek immortality, you can only do it in a cup of wine." The child also laughed along with Jiang Fuding's heroic spirit. For the first time, he joked, "When we meet in the future, you must treat me to good wine." Jiang Fuding threw the bamboo basket into the sea and rubbed the child's head. "It's not a big deal." The child was stunned. He said anxiously, Jiang Fuding. Why did you throw the steamed bun basket away? I want to bring it back for Grandpa. Jiang Fuding was stunned and speechless. He was in the wrong. A long time later, in the Jianghu where the grandmasters of the older generation passed away one after another, there would be a very interesting saying. Yudilong wasn't really invincible. It was because there were still some tricks in the world. The people south of the Guangling River in Liang found it hard to imagine that there were places where the frost hadn't completely stopped at the beginning of summer. This was the Tu Liao. There were black mountains and white rivers here. Perhaps the first snow of the Liang dynasty would fall here, and it would also be the last snow. The winter snowstorm here was known as the Great Smoke Bubble, blotting out the sky and the sun. During the cold winter of last year, 2 people were escorted by Qi Jiajie from the north of Jingji into Liao and Liao. The reason why the number 1 swordsman in the capital was naturally because Groom Yu was a martial arts master that many forces were secretly trying to rope in. After Groom Yu declined the emperor's invitation to stay, Emperor Zhao Zhuan asked Qi Jiajie to escort him all the way to dispel the covetous thoughts of the other forces. As the first disciple of Wang Xianji, being on good terms with Groom Yu was almost equivalent to accepting the mantle of the martial emperor's city. Lu Huang, Lu Bank, Lin Ye, and the other 3, even if they couldn't be of use to themselves, they could at least establish a good relationship with these top masters who were of the same breath and branch. Therefore, Qi Jiajie passed a message to the emperor at the border, telling Groom Yu that no matter when he returned to Great Peace City, His Majesty would treat him as a friend. On the banks of a river called the Songnan River in Jinzhou of Liaodong, there was a small village along the river. There were about 100 families, and most of the young adults in the village were hunters. It was said that the ancestors of a certain family once caught 2 gerfalcons in their lifetime and sent them as tributes to the governor's office that Liang had set up in Liao and Liao at that time. The family's heirloom, a well-made hard bow, was an additional gift from the governor's office in addition to the reward. There were 2 distinguished guests staying in the village. At the end of last winter, a group of hunters encountered a black bear that didn't enter hibernation for some reason. It was their benefactor who chased away the giant bear. After that, the young adults in the village liked to learn from the young man, and the children in the village also liked to play with the girl who liked to wear green. When summer came, the girl in green, who could finally take off her heavy fur coat, was very happy. Moreover, she had frostbite that winter, but she didn't feel that it was difficult to bear. Xiao Yu, on the other hand, always felt guilty. In fact, she didn't like Liao and Liao at first, because when they first arrived here, it was the height of the snowstorm. The terrible weather of the big fireworks was like a show of strength to her and Xiao Yu. Until they stopped in this village, she was led by her new friends to fish in the frozen river, or to sit on a wooden board and slide on the ice. Every day, she could have a snowball fight with more than 10 people of the same age, which made her feel new and happy. Therefore, when Xiao Yu said that he wanted to go to Liao Bay, she was not willing, and then Xiao Yu didn't urge her anymore. Over time, she and Xiao Yu began to look like natives of Liaodong. Xiao Yu carried a bow and arrows, went hunting with the adults in the village, and began to raise young eagles under the guidance of the old hunters. She no longer wondered why the windows here were papered outside, why every house had big and small jars of pickles, and why the adults would say that if the children didn't listen to them, they would be hung in the basket. Today, Xiao Yu was helping a family in the village cut a plant that was more than 5 feet tall, which the locals called Lamus chinensis, to build a house. Of course, it was not the grass that sheep ate. Its stem was hollow, similar to the bamboo in her hometown. She quietly squatted by the side, watching Xiao Yu cut the stem with a knife, thinking that he was quite handsome. She remembered that the day before Grandpa Gao left Wulin City, he had a private chat with her. He talked about a lot of people, but she couldn't remember most of them. Only when he talked about Xiao Yu did she pay special attention, so she remembered clearly. Grandpa Gao said that among the swordsmen in the world, some had the best luck, and some had the best innate talent, but Xiao Yu's talent for swordsmanship was the best. She squatted on the ground. Thinking of Grandpa Gao, she suddenly felt sad. She actually knew that his surname was Wang, but he was so tall. She liked to call him Grandpa Gao, and he was never unhappy. Then she thought of another person. Before that person died, he called out to her, "Green robe." Xiao Yu said that person was very amazing, and that Grandpa Gao admired him for most of his life. She suddenly asked, "Xiao Yu, Grandpa Gao asked you to find that person, so you can accept him as a disciple on behalf of your master. But how do we find him?" Yu Groom turned his head and smiled. "We can always find him." She said, "Oh, I'm going to play." Then she got up and ran away. Yu Groom smiled knowingly, just like this little girl's brother. He was always afraid that she would find the trip to Liaodong boring, but now it seemed that he worried too much. The only trouble was that this little girl had learned a lot of local sayings from the local children, such as, "You're stupid," "Scram," and "Stay away." Just thinking about it made Yu Groom break out in a cold sweat. As for the little brother, who was still in some unknown corner, in a sense, he was equivalent to his master's closed-door disciple. Yu Groom was not in a hurry at the moment. He firmly believed that they would naturally meet when the time came. This was a strange intuition. Yu Groom waited patiently. In the 500 years of Jianghu, there was only one Wang Xianji and one Li Chenggang. In the evening, Yu Groom helped the villagers with their work. When he returned to the house, the owner of the house had already prepared dinner. Yu Groom did not know where the little girl was playing, so he could only imitate the villagers and shout. Soon, a response came from the riverside. She quickly ran back, lifted her skirt, and lightly stepped over the threshold. She saw Xiao Yu and the family already sitting on the brick bed. Because they waited for her, they did not eat. She made a face at Xiao Yu and then sat next to him apologetically. Yu Groom helplessly reminded her in a low voice, "How can the host wait for the guest to eat?" The middle-aged village woman liked the girl in green from the bottom of her heart. She quickly smiled and said, "It doesn't matter." The middle-aged man who looked like a southerner poured a glass of wine for Yu Groom. The man was actually a foreigner, and his wife was a local. His ancestral home was in Dongyue. Back then, he followed his grandfather and father to Jinzhou. However, he went north earlier than Hongjia. It was a blessing in disguise. He was lucky to escape the spring and autumn war that burned the central plains. Because Liaoxi was the place where Liang rose, Liaodong also benefited a lot. Although it was not as good as Liaoxi, it was still worlds apart from the people of Dongyue who had heavy taxes. Moreover, everyone knew that there was a king with a different surname who came out of the forest, in Jinzhou. In addition, the king of Liang who was in charge of the two Liaoxi was Zhao Sui, the king of Jiaodong. Zhao Sui was also very kind to the people in his jurisdiction. Although Beimang and Liang were in confrontation for many years, the flames of war had never spread here. Therefore, even the middle-aged man had never seen war since childhood. When the man's family was convicted and moved north, they brought a large box of books with them. Even if it was passed down to only one child in 4 generations, each generation of parents taught their children to read and write. They were able to do something that many nobles in the Central Plains could not do. The reason why Yu Groom chose to live in this house was that he felt close to the middle-aged man's scholarly aura, which was extremely rare in the north. When he heard that Yu Groom was leaving the village for Jinzhou the next day, the man inevitably felt a little regretful that he did not have a drinking buddy. Probably after drinking half a bowl of wine, the middle-aged man, who could not hold his liquor but was good at drinking, did not have too many taboos. He smiled and asked in a low voice, "Brother Yu, are you going to see the ancestral home of the king of Biyao?" To tell you the truth, there's nothing to see. First, ordinary people can't get close because the guards of the king's mansion are watching. Second, many people say that there are only 2 or 3 shabby houses. It's said that many people who went to Jinzhou to join in the fun went in high spirits but returned in disappointment. Yu Groom asked, "Many people go to Jinzhou?" The man gulped down the remaining half bowl of wine and said with a smile, "That's right. There are many stories about this. We're only about 80 miles away from Jinzhou. When the village finds something valuable, such as mink fur and fox fur, especially the old ginseng that the Shengguan family forbade to privately dig up, they'll be handed over to me, a bookkeeper, who can only read a few words, to secretly sell it in Jinzhou. That's why I'm not unfamiliar with Jinzhou." Although the woman had a very good impression of the groom and the little girl, when her husband talked about selling ginseng privately, she still secretly kicked him. Chapter 15:14. The man could not openly criticize his wife, so he pretended that nothing had happened. He continued, as for the famous butcher, even though he left Jinzhou for more than 20 years and died in Biyao, people in Jinzhou still talk about him with relish. The first decade was the most lively. It was said that many powerful families in the Central Plains who had irreconcilable enmity with Butcher did not dare to go to Biyao for revenge, so they thought about digging up the ancestral grave of the Su family. If our king of Jianghu had not been on good terms with Butcher, I'm afraid he would have been killed. In my opinion, our king of Jianghu was also implicated by Butcher. Otherwise, with his ability, he would not be in such a bleak situation now. Last time, you said that Zhao Ying, the Duke of Huainan, also died heroically in battle. Our king is not comparable to Butcher and the king of Yan, but compared to the Duke of Huainan and the new king of Jing'an, he is more than enough, right? Otherwise, he would not be able to sit on the position of the king of Jianghu. Besides Biyao, only the vassal territories here face to face with the barbarians of Beimang, right? If the late emperor did not trust our king's ability, he would not dare to make such an arrangement. Yu Groom nodded. The late emperor of Liang had painstakingly placed Zhao Ying in Huainan Dao, which was right under his nose. He banished the ambitious Zhao Bing to Nanjiang. He let his brother Zhao Yi, who had the same father and mother, govern the richest Guangling Dao. The king of Jing'an, who was the most unruly, was placed in Xiangfan, Qingzhou, which was surrounded by enemies. Only Su Xiao and Zhao Sui were placed in the two places of Beijiang. The middle-aged man, who was neither a scholar nor a scholar, had unwittingly drunk 2 bowls of wine. Originally, he could only hold this much alcohol, but perhaps it was because 1,000 cups were not enough for a bosom friend. He poured himself another bowl. His wife could not stop him. He raised the bowl and smelled it, but did not drink. He raised his head and looked at Yu Groom opposite him. His eyes were a little unfocused. This middle-aged man, who was far away from the smoke of war and the court, seemed to be talking to himself. The Dongwei where my ancestors were in was destroyed by General Gu Jiantang. Perhaps it was not the work of Ren Tuesday. My grandfather had never had any ill feelings towards Ren Tu, and I am no exception. I heard that Tai and city was the place where people scolded Ren Tu the most in the world. Then, it was Guangling Dao, which was known as the talented scholar, followed by Jiangnan, where there were countless distinguished scholars. Now, even the new king of Liang is being scolded together. It seems that the more they scold, the more powerful they get. One of them is the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights. I heard that he is from Beijiang. Hey, so I really want to understand one thing. Since those people have all become officials of the Liang imperial court, many of them have not even seen Ren Tu and the new king of Liang. Even the rise of their families can be attributed to Ren Tu's victory. Younger brother, you have seen a lot. Looking at your temperament, I think you are also a well-read person. Can you help me clear up my doubts? Groom Yu hesitated and smiled, pick up the bowl to eat, put down the chopsticks to curse. The middle-aged man sighed, yes. A country without a hero is like a house without a pillar, a person without a backbone. The man drank a big mouthful of the 3rd bowl of wine and was really drunk. He fell asleep under the care of his wife. He muttered to himself that if the new Liang prince couldn't defend the northwest, he would also curse, including the young king's father. The middle-aged man's wife didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She nagged, do you really think you are a high official? I don't see you working so hard on the crops all these years. Although the woman was nagging, she lowered her head to look at her man's face, which was much rougher than when he was young. Her slightly tanned face couldn't help but reveal a smile. She thought to herself, who asked you to be so handsome? Back then, I had to fight with many women to get you. Even if your farming is sloppy, it doesn't matter. After hearing that, Groom Yu suddenly drank a bowl of wine and said indifferently, a country without a hero, how sad. A country that has heroes but doesn't know how to respect them, how sad is that? Groom Yu got off the Kong and brought a small stool with the little girl to sit outside the room. He turned his head to look at her, who was in a daze, and said with a smile, "How about we go somewhere else to find your Grandpa Gao's disciple?" The little girl turned her head and rolled her eyes. "If you want to go to Biyao, just say it." "I don't really care." Groom Yu was a little embarrassed. He was about to say something when the little girl said seriously, "Go, go. I miss Uncle Lu anyway." This Uncle Lu, when he was still in Wu City, he didn't know how to take care of himself. "I don't feel at ease with him away." Groom Yu rubbed her little head and smiled, "Yes, yes. Uncle Lu, Uncle Gong, and your Aunt Lin, they can't do without you." She hurriedly shushed him. "You have to call her Sister Lin. If you call her Aunt Lin, she'll get angry." Groom Yu laughed. "No wonder Master said you're not afraid of anything except the forest crows." The little girl suddenly sighed and said earnestly to Groom Yu, "Xiao Yu, let's make a deal first. When we reach Biyao, let's not fight and talk nicely, okay?" Groom Yu pretended to be surprised. "Eh? Who said we shouldn't quarrel if we can use our fists?" The little girl raised her chin and said fiercely, "I haven't said the second half of my sentence. When it's time to quarrel, we should discuss things properly. Those who use their fists aren't heroes." Groom Yu narrowed his eyes and said softly, "If you travel to Jianghu in the future, you'll definitely become a heavenly heroine." The little girl nodded vigorously and then put her head on Groom Yu's knee. She said in a muffled voice, "Xiao Yu, I've wanted to go to Biyao for a long time. I want to visit the place where Grandpa Gao passed away." Groom Yu nodded lightly and didn't say anything. The little girl raised her head slightly. There were still traces of tears, but there was a smile on her face. Xiao Yu, Biyao is in the northwest. Then won't we be eating the northwest wind every day?" Groom Yu smiled. "Yes, there are battlefields everywhere. We might have to eat a lot of sand." It was not easy to be an official in the capital. Even though Fan Zhongho, who had been bestowed the title of the #1 national chess player of the dynasty by the emperor, had become a new noble in the Hanlin Academy, he couldn't help but sigh. The Fan family could be said to be a scholarly family. However, in Jianghu, it was not considered a luxurious family. When he was summoned to the capital, he went north alone. He didn't bring any servants with him. He had about 700 to 800 taels of silver on him. He thought that even if he couldn't be extravagant in the capital, he wouldn't be too shabby. He didn't think that when he actually became an official in the capital, he would realize how expensive it was. After all, Fan Zhongho had never received the special honor of being conferred by the emperor, and he wasn't a true scholar in the imperial examinations. He didn't have a master room in Tai and city to rely on, and he didn't have the financial support of his fellow countrymen. However, for officials in the capital, especially Huang Menlang of the Hanlin Academy, their residences had to match the prestige of the official system. Thus, Fan Zhongho gritted his teeth and rented the old residence of an old assistant minister of the Ministry of Works. It could barely be considered a place with a pavilion, a garden, and lush greenery. However, this cost him 200 taels of silver. That was the price the old assistant minister gave him for the sake of Huang Menlang. If it were any other official, not to mention 200 taels of silver, even 400 taels of silver wouldn't be enough. The Liang imperial court did not take care of everything in the matter of official uniforms. Other than a few sets of official uniforms that were set by the Ministry of Rights, the rest had to be provided by the officials themselves. The purchase of a wide variety of official uniforms was another large expense. Fan Zhongho had only learned after working for a period of time in the Hanlin Academy that many old-fashioned old Hanlin scholars who did not know how to make money were so poor that they had to borrow official uniforms all year round. To make matters worse, Fan Zhongho, as a newly popular person in the great and city officialdom, had to attend a variety of banquets and weddings and funerals of his colleagues. This caused this young man to spend money like water. Adding on the dignity of the Hanlin Academy, the ink and paper that he needed for his daily study, he had all kinds of connections. Fortunately, when Fan Zhongho went to the capital, he had brought with him about 20 unique and rare books that had been engraved. Many of his colleagues in the Hanlin Academy loved books to the point that they would borrow money to buy books even if they were poor. After receiving this gift, Fan Zhongho started to gain a foothold in the Hanlin Academy. He also promised many of the officials in the capital that he would buy the locally engraved and large books in his hometown that were relatively cheap. This gave Fan Zhongho a good impression. In reality, the purchase was just an excuse. He was giving away his treasures from the library at home. He believed that those old foxes who had cultivated for half their lives in the government knew this, but neither side said it out loud. Most of the officials from outside the capital lived in the southeast area of the city. The scenery here was not bad. Scholars from the south like Fan Zhongho all had to enter the capital through this area. Therefore, those prominent officials from Liang, even though they had been given positions in the court of the inner city, still had their own residences here. It was convenient for them to guide their descendants. Most of the recitation gatherings in Great and City were held here. From spring to summer, it was close to the Mang seed. There was an old saying that spring fought for the sun and summer fought for the time. In the past, it was always the Mang seed time. Large numbers of scholars and refined scholars would hold gatherings near the Shinran Pavilion. What was interesting was that some family was so large that they had specially set up 20 or so mu of rice fields that were not easily seen in the north for people to enjoy. In the summer, every night, there would be frogs croaking. This year's Shinran Pavilion gathering was especially interesting. It was unknown if those old officials had a tacit understanding. From Secretary of the Secretariat Qi Yanglong to Tantanan of Menxia Province, to Zhao Yuling and Yin Mao Chun who had risen in the eternal Hui Spring, none of them participated this year. But from Chen Wang, Yan Jieshi, Jin Lanting, Li Jifu, Gao Tingshu, Sun Yin, and the others, these young people, with the greatest reputation in Great and City, almost none of them were absent. They all attended this Shinran Pavilion gathering. Fan Zhongho, who had risen in fame, was also present. This gathering of people did not strictly have an initiator. They just called their friends and brought them along. The Shinran Pavilion became unprecedentedly lively. Chapter 15:15. At that time, Fan Zhongho and the youth from the Imperial Astronomer had a discussion in front of the Emperor and Empress. In the end, 6 people stayed until the end. Among them, Chen Wang and the Zhuangyuan Li Jifu had a good chat. The imperial brother-in-law, Yan Qiji, chatted with Song Kelly, and he, Fan Zhongho, got along well with the crazy Sun Yin on chess. Interestingly, his experience in the bureaucracy of the capital followed this trend. Li Jifu was often an honored guest of the Qin Manor, and in the Hanlin Academy, Yan Qiji and the young phoenix of the Song family studied history together. It was said that they got along very well. Although Fan Zhongho and Sun Yin were not close friends, they would occasionally talk about the state of the world. Today, Fan Zhongho met with Sun Yin and then went to the Shinran Pavilion together. In Great Peace City, many officials would laugh and say, "High officials ride thin horses and don't show off their wealth." But Sun Yin, who had been banished, was different. He openly bought a tall horse from Bailiang and rode this horse to and fro every court meeting and when he was on duty. It was very eye-catching. Today, Fan Zhongho had the good fortune to ride a horse with the wind. He rode the same horse with Sun Yin. When they arrived near the Shinran Pavilion, where there were many carriages and tourists, Fan Zhongho flipped off the horse and couldn't help but rub his butt. Sun Yin, this guy, really rode in Great Peace City. Fan Zhongho was going to suffer. When Sun Yin saw Fan Zhongho's sorry state, he gloated. They arrived at the Shinran Pavilion one after the other in an inconspicuous carriage. 2 men wearing simple but elegant green robes stepped out. Sun Yin saw that they were Chen Wang, the assistant of the left scattered cavalry, and Li Jifu, the Zhuangyuan scholar. He originally thought that, according to Sun Yin's noble nature, he would at most give them a sidelong glance and then ignore them. Unexpectedly, Sun Yin actually took the initiative to pull him forward. Li Jifu, who also saw the 2 of them, obviously did not expect Sun Yin to greet them. He could not conceal the incredulity in his eyes. On the other hand, Chen Xiaobao, who was the most successful official in the entire Liang dynasty, whose official career was comparable to that of Jin Saburo, did not show the slightest bit of surprise. He warmly smiled at them and said, "Brother Sun, Mr. Yuetian, let me make it clear in advance that I still won't drink today. I can only use tea as a substitute for wine. Sun Yin coldly snorted and said, "So what if you drink tea? I'll drink wine. Let's each have a cup. I can still make the assistant go to the toilet 4, 5, 6, or 7 times." Chen Wang bitterly smiled and cupped his fists to beg for mercy. "Brother Sun, please don't bully a fellow countryman. I implore Brother Sun to point the spearhead at Ji Fu. Otherwise, Mr. Yuetian is also fine." Fan Jianghu smiled and said, "Assistant Minister, you can't just rely on your high official status to divert trouble to someone else. It will damage the reputation of the court." Li Jifu looked at the 3 people who were talking without restraint and felt a little envious. Although he had many private gatherings with the assistant minister, who was both a relative of the emperor and an important official of the court, he had never really let loose. Every time he returned home from a gathering, he would even think carefully about whether there was something wrong with his words or if there was something wrong with his words or if he had been rude. It was no wonder that Li Jifu was worried about personal gains and losses. Everyone knew that Qin Xiaobao, who was the #1 official of the emperor, would soon have a place in the small court meeting. Moreover, compared to other officials in the capital, Li Jifu knew more reliable insider information. The secretariat of the Liang Imperial Court had been empty for decades. After Qi Yanglong took over, it could be said that there were many things waiting to be done. Chen Wang, who was the assistant minister of the left scattered cavalry in Wuxia province, although he was already a third-rank official, it was very likely that he would be transferred to the secretariat of the secretariat within a year or 2 and take up the position of assistant minister of the secretariat that no one had yet confirmed. There were many assistant ministers in the 3 provinces and 6 ministries, but the assistant minister of the secretariat was undoubtedly the most important one. It was not that the Hanlin Academy did not have a good title, but it was the trend. However, these rules did not affect Qin Xiaobao. A 30-year-old assistant minister of the secretariat might not be considered shocking in the old Liang dynasty, but Li Jifu dared to say that this was a feat that would never be repeated in the future. Zhao Yuling, Yin Maochun, Jean Lanting, all of them had their eyes fixed on the title of Grand Secretary. However, only Chen Wang was so absent-minded and leisurely strolling. Perhaps many people present at the time did not expect that this gathering at the Shinran Pavilion in the 2nd year of the auspicious era would leave behind many popular and elegant stories in the history of the future. Dong Yuran, who was personally praised by Tantanon as the son of the Dong family has ghosts and gods, whose writing is like a spring breeze, wrote the famous poem, Shinran Pavilion. Huang Quan, the young artist who had helped Tantanon make an exception for Qi Yanglong, was personally spread out on rice paper by the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, Jean Lanting. After getting drunk, he splashed ink and painted a painting that was hung in the imperial study that day, Drunken 8 Immortals. As for the poem that spread throughout the capital almost overnight, it was started by Sun Yin, followed by Jean Lanting, Yan Qiji, Song Kelly, Chen Wang, Fan Zhangho, and Gao Tingshu, a total of 64 people. Together, they wrote this world-shaking long poem. Of course, on this day, how could the Shinran Pavilion only be filled with handsome heroes and not beautiful women? The 3 most popular courtesans in the capital, each with their own merits, went up the stage one after another. They either danced or sang, especially the woman who had once been on the rouge list, Li Baisher, who was known as the best in both voice and appearance. Her solo dance could be said to have shocked everyone. What was even more surprising was that after that day, there was no news of Li Baisher in Great Peace City. She disappeared so decisively, as if she had never been in this world. Afterwards, based on the words she said at the banquet, people guessed that she had fallen in love with an unknown swordsman and wanderer. From then on, they went off to roam the Jianghu together. There was no wind and rain, and the wind naturally dissipated. The people at the banquet didn't leave until late at night. Li Jifu was already drunk to the point of unconsciousness. Chen Wang, the highest-ranking official and the only one who did not drink, wanted to personally take Li Jifu away, but was urged to stay. He really couldn't leave and could only ask someone to take Li Jifu back. That person was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, Jean Lanting. He personally helped Li Jifu back to the carriage with Gao Tingshu. Sun Yin also left late. He came with 2 people, but left alone, as if there was no one around. He rode his horse wildly, smelling of alcohol, and shocked many of the graceful ladies of the large families in the capital. Under the crowd's instigation, Fan Jianghu and Wu Songxian had another battle of who's first and who's last. Both sides played their best moves one after another. Although Wu Songxian lost the game, he didn't lose his momentum, which made the spectators exclaim in satisfaction. After this game, Wu Songxian vaguely established Fan Jianghu's second place in Liang's Go. Yan Qiji, Song Kelly, and that fellow villager nicknamed Kong Wuqi left together. Shinran Pavilion, Drunken Eight Immortals, and Heroes Travel to the Capital were all given to this young relative of the emperor. He would immediately send them to the imperial palace. Deep in the night, the lights were still bright. There were only a dozen people left in Shinran Pavilion. Everyone in the capital knew that Chen Wang, who usually did not touch alcohol, was the last to leave. Fan Jianghu and Wu Songxian had already finished their game of Go. The latter and a group of friends left in high spirits. The people still in the pavilion were all new nobles in the Great Peace City. They were also willing to put down their faces to get close to Chen Wang, a high official in the central government. However, they were all scholars. Even if they drank too much, their chatter and actions did not diminish their scholarly habits. And Chen Wang was never the kind of person who liked to put on airs, so he got along well with them. In the end, it was unknown who was still unsatisfied, so they spent some money to call over a musician who had earned money in this gathering. The woman held a pipa in her arms and did not wear any makeup. Although she was not a national beauty, under the flickering lights, there was a hint of lovely and moving feeling. She was very timid. It was clear that business at the banquet today was slow and she did not attract any business. She was not like the other women of the same trade. While they were tired, they had already returned full of money. This woman sat on a small stool prepared outside the pavilion. Before she played the pipa, she quickly glanced at the people sitting on the prayer mats in front of the pavilion. There were more than a dozen people, most of them sitting on the prayer mats on the steps. The steps had different heights. At the highest point sat two young men side by side. She could guess that since these people were able to appear in Shinran Pavilion and not far from the pavilion like most of the scholars, then they should be the most important people at the banquet today. They were the true important people of Great Peace City. Even if they were not today, they would be in the future. She was lost in thought for a moment. She was very curious what it would be like if these young masters who were waiting for her pipa put on their official robes. The young master who had hired her to sing was sitting at the bottom of the steps. He smiled and reminded her in a gentle voice, "Miss, it is time to start." Her pretty face blushed and she appeared slightly nervous. She said softly, "Young master, please wait a moment. Allow this servant to test the sound." Hearing the woman gently twist the strings of the pipa, Fan Jianghu, who had intentionally or unintentionally sat next to Chen Xiaobao, said with a slight smile, "This is the typical technique of the Wu family of Jiangsu in our Xiangzhou. The lower part is the strength of the upper part. The tone is not high, the rhythm is not rushed, and it is slow. It is not as full as the big bows of the north, but it has its own unique charm. Due to this, the song is also a small tune with the charm of Jiangnan. After drinking too much, it is very comfortable to listen to this song." Chen Wang smiled and nodded. He said softly, "I only learned about the pipa when I came to Jing. In my hometown, there is a saying about the drum on horseback. In the past, I was just a poor scholar and did not go to the border to study. I am ashamed to say that even if I wanted to pretend to be cultured, I would only be a laughingstock. Therefore, in these years, I have sensibly not attended banquets and gatherings. Other people say that I am not good at raising wang, that is really flattering me." The name of the song, Daughter's Red, refers to the Jiangnan water, Jiangnan wine, and Jiangnan women. Then he heard the woman's clear and melodious voice reciting the first part of the song. Fan Jianghu was surprised. He smiled and said, "What a coincidence. It refers to the daughter's red wine. My hometown has this custom since ancient times. When a daughter is born, they will bury a jar of wine. When the wine is drunk, it is the day the woman gets married. In addition, there is also the Zhuangyuan red, which is taken out for banquets when the man in the family obtains scholarly honors. Chapter 15-16. Then Fan Jianghu suddenly discovered that Qin Wang seemed to be in a trance. One part of the millet fragrance lingers around the beam, 2 parts of the flowing water, the cool weather, 3 parts of the fragrance of apricot flowers. A spring thunder buries a jar, after 18 years, the daughter is red, the daughter smiles, the daughter is delicate, the new wine becomes old wine, the little girl is waiting to wear the red dress. Fan Jianghu closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the pipa and the woman singing. He finally sighed softly. The ending of this song was not as beautiful as the name of the wine. The woman in the song had waited for many years, but still did not meet the young master who was far away. She also did not wear the red dress for another man, and died just like that. According to custom, if the woman in the family died before she was married, then the jar of daughter's red wine would be called Biyao, and would be taken out and drunk. At the end of the song, it was said that the young master had finally returned home. Although he was the top scholar, he could only drink the jar of wine alone at the grave. After Fan Jianghu opened his eyes, he could not see anything strange from Qin Wang's face. The song ended, and the people gradually dispersed. There was no need for Fan Jianghu to ask. Someone had taken the initiative to lend him a fine horse. When Fan Jianghu mounted the horse, he inadvertently turned his head and saw Qin Wang standing outside the pavilion. He seemed to have said something to the little girl singing, and then walked towards the carriage. Fan Jianghu didn't have the slightest intention of probing further. With Qin Wang's well-known conduct and Fan Jianghu's understanding of this Qin Xiaobao, he definitely didn't think that this left scattered cavalry regular attendant would have the slightest intention of taking advantage of him. Fan Jianghu slowly rode his horse. Back then, he was far away in the Jianghu, and now he was high up in the imperial court. Benevolent teacher, even that Sun Yin wants to be an official. Although I, Fan Jianghu, cannot play your game of spring and autumn, but I will do my best to play my own game of chess well. In the distance, Qin Wang boarded the carriage. Before boarding, he asked the woman holding the pipa a question. He asked her if the young master in the song was better off not returning at all if he returned late. The woman was timid, and did not know how to answer. Qin Wang did not mean it, so he bid farewell and left. Qin Wang slumped against the wall of the carriage. Even when he married that noble surnamed Zhao back then, even when his father-in-law was a duke of a county, Qin Wang did not drink at the wedding banquet. For this reason, many of the noble sons of the Zhao clan who attended the wedding had mocked and ridiculed him. However, after so many years, he, Qin Wang, had swept through the various departments of the capital, leaping through the Dragon Gate time and time again. Not to mention those unaccomplished noble sons, even those powerful dukes and county kings only dared to sit on equal footing with him. Today, Qin Wang actually brought back a small bottle of wine. Just yesterday, he had received a secret intelligence report verbally. There were only 4 words in the message: dead. He felt guilty. Biyao was the one who felt guilty. Already dead. She was just like the pitiful woman in the song who waited from New Hong to Huadiao, but did not see anyone. In the south of Jiangnan, it rained every family during the Huang May season. In the north of the northwest, the reeds were fluttering. Qin Wang drank the wine one mouthful after another. Silently, he drank without stopping, and his tears flowed without stopping. At the time, Qin Wang's first thought was to vent his anger on that young vassal king, to vent his anger on the entire Biyao, where he had long had nothing to worry about. Everything he had done these years, apart from the silver back then and the kindness of recognizing his worth, was more because she was in Biyao. He hoped for Biyao's stability. In the end, he only hoped for her to be stable. For this reason, he was not afraid of accompanying a monarch was like accompanying a tiger, not afraid of the treacherous clouds of officialdom. This extremely patient man was only afraid that he would talk in his sleep and call out that name. However, in the end, he, who could rely on his own words to change the world's copyright, who could persuade the emperor to increase his efforts to restrict the transport of grain, did nothing. On the official road, under the curtain of night, in the carriage, there was a man who might become the second Grand Secretary Zhang of Liang. He was like a child, wailing loudly. If one were to say that the first year of Xiangfu was a year that left the Liang Orthodox faction shocked, but they still had a card up their sleeve, then the second year of Xiangfu was a year where wind and rain covered the sky, making people gradually feel uneasy. In the late spring of this year, under Chao Chengqing's personal leadership, the West Chu rebels' arrogance reached the heavens. King of Jing and Zhao Sun's Qingzhou navy couldn't rescue them in time. The vassal King Zhao Yi's Guangling navy was completely wiped out. This also directly led to the balance of power that Song Li had won with great difficulty in Guangling province being easily broken on the surface of the Guangling River. What was even more worrying was that the most important reinforcements of the southern border's elite army, after the Qingzhou navy, whose battle strength was inferior to Guangling's, had no choice but to avoid them. They could only disembark from a few narrow crossings in the upper reaches of the Guangling River. At the same time, the vassal King Zhao Yi, who had lost all of his naval forces, was defeated like a landslide. Following Xia Shi personally taking charge of the eastern front, coordinating with the West Chu navy down the river, the remnants of Zhao Yi's army could only turtle up in a corner. The territory they seized back from Song Li's hands seemed to have been handed over with both hands. The battle on the river affected the entire body. The southern expedition commander Lu Xingxiang's army had no choice but to stop and defend a few key points in place to prevent West Chu Xia Shi from leading his troops up north to take advantage of the situation to counterattack. This naturally caused the Liang Imperial Court's original plan of a pincer attack from the north and south to the east and west to surround West Chu's capital to the point that not even a drop of water could trickle through, to become a dream. Fortunately, during this time of turmoil, there was still a gathering at the Xinran Pavilion in the capital. This meant that the people's hearts were still stable. Furthermore, Chen Zhibao received the imperial edict and personally led 10,000 elite troops out of Shu. Furthermore, on the two Liaodong fronts and the northern border of Ji province, the great pillar state Gu Jiantang and the new general of Ji province, Yuan Tingshan, had won a series of beautiful battles. At noon, on the surface of the Guangling River, several large turreted ships that had recently been changed to flying the flag with the character Jiang on it went against the current. They did not stop at the river outside West Chu's capital, but instead continued to sail up the river. These warships were all seized from Guangling Prince Zhao Yi during the battle on the river. It was funny to say that these few turreted ships, which were supposed to display great power during the battle, were almost undamaged before the change of owners. On one of the towering turreted ships in the middle, there was a group of people leaning against the railing. There was a man with white hair on his temples, wearing a green robe that was the most elegant under the heavens. There was a young woman carrying a purple sword box on her back that was peerless in her generation. There were also military generals clad in armor. Each of them was high-spirited and vigorous, with a strict bearing. There was also a group of civil officials who had temporarily boarded the ship from the capital to enjoy the scenery, chatting and laughing. Among them, there were two young men who were the most eye-catching. If their identities were not taken into consideration, one of them had an ordinary appearance and a reserved bearing. He was only eye-catching because of the position he was standing in. He was standing beside the middle-aged man in green robe, frowning faintly. He was very different from the rest of the military generals and civil officials on the ship. The other young man made everyone's eyes brighten. They could not help but marvel at the fact that there was such a handsome man in the world. Wearing a white robe and a jade belt, he stood against the wind like a god or an immortal, enough to make others feel ashamed of their inferiority. The four people closest to the bow of the ship were Chao Chengqing, Jiang Enai, Xia Shibian, and Song Maolin. At present, Xia Shibian's reputation in the imperial court of Liang was extremely great. Even the common people had heard that an extraordinary genius general had emerged from the rebel army of West Chu. He had the bearing of a soldier of the spring and autumn period, Yi Baikue. As for Song Maolin, although he was a late bloomer in the imperial court of West Chu, he was not inferior to Xia Shibian, who had established brilliant military achievements. The two of them, one in civil and the other in military, were known as the twin jade annulus of Dechu. Because of Song Maolin's outstanding appearance, he was like an immortal banished from the world. In addition to his brilliant literary talent, other than being known as the twin jade annulus of Dechu, he was also known as the northern Su and the southern Song dynasty together with the northwest vassal king. Song Maolin was born into a rich and powerful family, so he was probably a true proud son of heaven. The main pillar of West Chu, Chao Chongqing, whose hair was even more white, suddenly turned his head to Xia Shibian and laughed in a low voice. What's wrong? It wasn't easy to chase away Song Li, but in the end, Chen Zhibao from the east came to the Qingzhou Navy, Wu Zhongshuan from the south, and Lu Xingxiang from the north is also truly in control of military power. Do you think the fierce battle has just begun? Xia Shibian said softly, if General Ko was still here, it would be much better. Chao Chongqing laughed casually. Don't worry about that guy. He has a big temper, yes, and his heart is not small either. Xia Shibian was silent, as if he was afraid of something taboo. Chao Chongqing sighed. Last year, old Grand Preceptor's son said that West Chu was a burden to me, Chao Chongqing. Today, I also want to say something to you. It is I, Chao Chongqing, who is a burden to you, my student. Xia Shibian shook his head. Teacher, you must not think this way. I have been a citizen of Dechu for generations. Dechu was born in Xia Shibian, and I am willing to die for it. Chao Chongqing suddenly laughed. There is a young man who should really get to know you. Only then will he know what it means to be a scholar. That guy, back in the day, had a lot of resentment towards us scholars. In Gangnam-do, the first time he saw Tangshi sword immortal Lu Baijie, he asked, Teacher, can you sell me a few pounds of benevolence, righteousness, and morals? When he saw me, he did not have a good expression either. Xia Shibian was puzzled. But I have seen Beiliang's various actions. They have established academies within their borders, and are very kind to scholars. The new Prince of Liang does not seem like this kind of person. Chao Chongqing smiled knowingly. Perhaps it is because a man has a burden on his shoulders, so he cannot do as he pleases. No matter what, Su Fengnian is indeed the most interesting young man I have seen in my life. There is no one like him. Afterwards, Chao Zhongqing suddenly laughed to himself and said in self-mockery, even if I, Chao Zhongqing, praise him like this, Su Fengnian wouldn't feel the slightest bit of honor. After all, he is the #1 vassal king of Liyang who commands 300,000 cavalry, and at the same time, he is also a martial arts grandmaster on par with me, Chao Guanzi. So no matter how many good words I say, it can only be considered as mutual appreciation. To be honest, when I first saw that kid a few years ago, I never would have thought that the situation would be like today. If I had known, I would have beaten him up back then. Now that I am talking about it with you, it is easier to brag. Xia Shibian felt a little sad for no reason. Although his teacher was always easy to get along with, he was not such a talkative elder. Chao Chongqing seemed to have seen through Xia Shibian's thoughts. He patted the young man's shoulder and smiled. When young people do young things, it is fine to be frivolous. There is no harm in saying that you are worried about new words. When you are 30, you can do things that are responsible. As for people like me who are old, they should honestly admit that they are old. Occasionally taking advantage of my seniority is one of the few pleasures in life. Chapter 15-17. Xia Shibian forced a smile. Dechu was most proud of Mr. Chao. Would he grow old? Chao Chongqing lowered his voice and said, that guest will secretly come in the evening. You and Song Maolin will stay by my side. You don't have to do anything. Xia Shibian asked worriedly, why does the current Duke of Yansheng, a saint family with a history of more than 800 years, want to meet you? I don't understand. What else is there to say? Chao Chongqing did not immediately give an answer. Lu Songtao, who became a Buddha in Lantua Mountain, came to him to persuade him to let it go. That Duke of Yansheng should be the same. Kings and officials can decide life and death with a word. Scholars like us are full of hot blood and have nothing to fear. However, if there was someone who could decide whether a person's name would be passed down through the ages or go down in infamy, wouldn't they calm down and think about it carefully? Chao Chongqing looked at the sky and muttered, when one has to let go of one's country, one can only let go. Jianghu can also be let go. But some things can't be let go even if I want to. No matter how much I read and how much I know, it is still the same. Xie Shibian was mentally wondering. If one day he could fight the Biyao cavalry on the battlefield, he would have no regrets even if he died. But such an opportunity would not appear. Jiang and I walked to a secluded place and looked at the rolling waves of the river alone. Song Maolin hesitated for a moment and came to her side. He said softly, "Princess." Jiang and I, who had her back facing this immortal, did not move. She pretended not to hear and let Song Maolin know to leave. Song Maolin smiled bitterly, "Princess, I only have one thing to say. I will leave after that." Jiang and I could only turn her head and said calmly, "Speak." Song Maolin's voice was warm as he said softly, "I can guess where you went and who you met a while ago. I don't dare to say anything. I only hope that you will not take such risks in the future. There are many things in the world that should be done by men. There is no reason for women to help." Jiang and I made an "oh" sound. Unfortunately, she did not say anything else. Song Maolin smiled and left. But in the next moment, Song Maolin was pleasantly surprised. The princess actually called his name. He suppressed the excitement in his heart and slowly turned around. Jiang and I smiled. "Someone asked me to pass a message to you. He said that the next time he sees you, he will definitely beat you up, until you can't recognize anyone." Jiang and I felt that he was already very kind. He changed the words father and mother to something that didn't hurt their relationship. Song Maolin's face stiffened as if he was struck by lightning. Poor exiled deity. On the border between Beimang and Liangliao, a group of armored cavalry troops roared past right under the noses of the Liang border's military sentries. The leader was the newest commander of Beimang's eastern front. He was a legendary figure who was somewhat similar to the Chuanqiu remnant that Hong Jia ran north into Beimang, but was also very different. This old man did not settle down in the southern dynasty. Instead, he traveled alone in the grasslands of Beimang. It was similar to how the Taiping emperor traveled in Liang. Although he was almost 50 years old, the armored old man still did not look old. One could vaguely see that he must have been a first-class handsome man when he was young. It was no wonder that in the past 10 years, he had been involved in many affairs. Even the Beimang palace heard that there was an unknown old man who had seduced many noble ladies. When this guy suddenly became the commander of the Eastern Front, the entire Beimang suddenly realized that it was him. Wang Sui. Along with Yi Baikue, Su Shao, and Gu Jiantang, Wang Sui was known as the four great generals of the spring and autumn period. He was the youngest and most unruly prince consort of Dongyue. Unlike Yi Baikue, who was victorious in every battle, he had only lost once. Unlike Su Shao, who was the ultimate winner, he had actually suffered many defeats. Unlike Gu Jiantang, who was suspected of not living up to his name, Wang Sui was truly undefeated on the battlefield he was in. The fall of Dongyue was attributed to the self-destruction of the city by the imperial court of Dongyue. It was Li Yang's plan to sow discord. He removed Wang Sui's commander-in-chief title, and Wang Sui himself gracefully abdicated and disappeared without a trace. After Wang Sui followed Dong Zhuo, Yang Yuanzhan, and Lu Gui as the main general of another front in Beimang. Unlike the three who each had their own personal troops, Wang Sui casually rode an old horse to the border to take up his post. In the mountainous eastern front of Beimang, Wang Sui did not promote or demote anyone boldly, nor did he treat people kindly and drink with the generals. He was like an outsider who had run over to watch a show. He did not care about anything and did not meddle in any military affairs. Every day, Wang Sui narrowed his eyes and strolled blindly among the various armies with his hands behind his back. This made the old forces who were originally uneasy or full of resentment dumbfounded. Then, the generals of Beimang became anxious. You motherf *Ker, doing nothing all day long. When the time comes, His Majesty will misunderstand that we are working together to ostracize you. If we, the old men, suffer such a great grievance for no reason, who can we find to reason with? Thus, someone suggested to have Wang Sui hold a military parade at the border. At the very least, he would be able to have a taste of being the number one figure in the Eastern Front Army. This would be compensation for this old man's understanding of the situation. Thus, today's scene of all the generals on the eastern front of Beimang had come out. However, many of the old generals of Beimang's border army and the older generals glanced at the fellow who was surrounded not far away from them with a cold smile. Wang Sui's awe-inspiring might was just for show. Wang Sui, in addition to the personal guards and elite cavalry that were randomly assembled by various factions, also had the personal attendance of Qiu Ju Bo De Ru 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 Ju Bo De Jingchong, as well as 4 to 5 young and strong captains by his side. The eastern front of Beimang claimed to have an army of 300,000, but in fact, it was only a little more than 200,000. There were 23 generals. Above them, there were 2 Beimang generals who were not as famous as Lu Gui and Yang Yuanzhan. This could not be helped. In the southern dynasty, the Bailiang cavalry could fight each other from afar and fight a few tough battles from time to time. However, on the peaceful eastern front, they could only confront the 2 big turtles, Zhao Sui, the prince of Jiaodong, and Gu Jiantang one after another. There was no military merit to be gained. Now, the situation was even worse. Under the secret instructions of the imperial decree of peace, the eastern front could only be defeated again and again. The 2 generals only felt that their old faces had been disgraced. Wang Sui suddenly pulled the reins and stopped his horse. The entire army could only stop their horses.